The last day's domain was the source of the energy of the calamity in the 3 dimensions. Once one took this path, then even a god would find it impossible to turn back. This meant that unless one found the passageway that led into the ancient god domain, one had no way to retreat. This path was extremely long. It traversed through boundless space that was completely filled with chaos, and as one flew within it, it was like traversing the torrent of time. It was deathly silent here. Xianxia sat cross-legged on the talisman armament while moving endlessly through space, and it seemed as if there was no end to it. It'll be a new beginning for everything, so I absolutely can't be careless. Xianxia took a deep breath and stopped thinking about it. And with a command in his heart, 2 divine artifacts floated into appearance in his surroundings. One was a chilly and seemingly illusory net. The other was 3 copper coins that were suffused with bright golden divine radiance. The overarching heaven net, an ultimate treasure of Oracle Mountain, and it was ranked at the 16th position amongst the 108 known natural spirit treasures in the 3 dimensions. This treasure was unfathomably profound, and it could capture the traces of the heaven Tao, fate, and karmic luck. All those years ago, the master of Oracle Mountain, Wuxia, had relied on this treasure to seize the river diagram in a battle of the gods. The copper coin of Treasurefall was ranked at the 24th position. It possessed monstrous divine might that was beyond imagination. So long as it was utilized, it was capable of making all artificial spirit treasures fall before it, and even if it was amongst natural spirit treasures, it was still a rare treasure. Presently, besides the talisman armament and the Netherworld Register Plus Condemn Evil Brush that were branded with the Terminus Tao Insight, only these 2 natural spirit treasures remained from all the divine artifacts Xianxia possessed. At this moment, for the sake of avoiding any mishaps from occurring, Xianxia had withdrawn both the overarching heaven net and copper coin of Treasurefall to defend his surroundings. After he did all of this, Xianxia finally felt slightly secure in his heart. Xianxia closed his eyes while the river diagram fragments within his sea of consciousness droned lightly and emanated a pure and illusory glow. After that, an incomplete diagram floated up into appearance from the river diagram fragments. On the diagram was a damaged iron sword. Half of it was dyed scarlet red with blood that seemed ready to drip at any moment, and the other half was scorched black as if it had suffered a heavy injury. Even if he'd stepped into the god-rank realm now and became a true world-enlightened true god, a trace of a tremble still couldn't help but arise in Xianxia's heart when his consciousness locked onto this damaged diagram. It was a form of reverence and terror. He felt as if he was an ant, and his cultivation at the sword god realm which he took pride in seemed to be weak and powerless before this bloodied damaged sword, because the aura of this bloodied damaged sword was too terrifying. Even if it had already been destroyed, even if it was only an incomplete diagram, it was sufficient to throw the universe into chaos and destroy all the Taos in the universe. This aura was absolutely not something that could be possessed in the 3 dimensions. It was even to the extent that Xianxia suspected that when this bloody damaged sword was born, even the might of the overarching heaven net that was ranked at the 16th position would be insufficient to be compared with it. Presently, my cultivation in the Sword Tao has already stopped at the perfection in the Sword God realm for too long. With this incomplete diagram, it should be able to allow me to step foot into the Sword Emperor realm as soon as possible. Xianxia held his breath in concentration while he immersed his heart and mind into the incomplete diagram, and he comprehended it in meditation. In these past few years, he'd frequently comprehended this incomplete diagram, and it allowed his cultivation in the Sword Tao to advance by leaps and bounds. This allowed him to be able to erupt with astounding combat strength in the numerous battles of the past. However, this didn't represent that he'd already grasped all the true essence within this incomplete diagram, and this clearly displayed exactly how extraordinary the origins of this incomplete diagram were. Merely comprehending some of its profundities had allowed Xianxia's cultivation in the Sword Tao to improve, and if this were to be known by others, they would probably not dare believe at all that such a terrifying inheritance existed in the world. Reality was indeed so. This incomplete diagram was absolutely the best in the world because it came from the river diagram. On the other hand, in terms of the Sword Emperor realm, Xianxia had always had a feeling that so long as he was able to break through to it, then some sort of special transformation would occur. If it was said that his comprehension in the sword Tao of the past was a type of quantitative accumulation, then once he stepped foot into the Sword Emperor realm, it would be a qualitative transformation. Xianxia really looked forward to this. Time flowed by silently, and over a month swiftly passed by. On this day, Xianxia suddenly opened his eyes. Bang! Right at this instant, this expanse of chaos had suddenly started to tremble. Space warped into an expanse of disorder, and it seemed like everything was about to collapse and be obliterated. When he saw this scene, Xianxia wasn't shocked but delighted instead, and a wisp of a smile of understanding suffused the corners of his mouth. I finally arrived. Shockingly, within his field of vision and at the depths of the extremely chaotic space, an extremely enormous vortex had appeared. The vortex seemed like a black hole at the deepest depths of the universe, and it ripped the chaos in the surroundings. The circle after circle of currents within the vortex caused even Xianxia to feel a strand of extremely heavy pressure, and he felt suffocated. So long as I pass through that vortex successfully, then I'll be able to arrive at the last day's domain. Swish! A strand of obscure chaotic energy surged over like a sharp glow, and it grazed Xianxia's sideburn as it passed and had almost struck his head. This was caused by the terrifying energy emanated from the vortex, and it was extremely shocking. It really is extraordinary. Xianxia took a deep breath before he suddenly charged over. His entire body was suffused with the glow of divinity, and he seemed like a rock as he tore through layer upon layer of space to flash explosively towards the vortex. Swoosh! A gray and hazy ray of flowing light that carried chaotic chi flickered with the glow of divinity, and it was dazzling and resplendent. Xianxia's figure dodged repeatedly, but those gray-colored rays of flowing light were too densely packed, and all of them had been shot out from within the extremely enormous vortex. No matter how he dodged, his shoulder was still grazed in the end. Pooh! Blood sprayed into air. With his current strength at the world-enlightened true God realm, Xianxia had actually been injured by this strike. Xianxia's expression remained unchanged when facing this. He puckered his lips while divine flames surged within his black eyes, and from the beginning until the end, his figure hadn't stopped at all. Along with the passage of time, he grew closer and closer to the vortex. However, the attacks he suffered grew more and more dense, and they were like a storm that enveloped this area. It was unknown what sort of energy those gray and hazy flowing lights were, but they were extremely terrifying. They caused even an expert at the God rank realm like Xianxia to feel extremely great pressure and danger. Swish! 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 Another expanse of gray and hazing strands of flowing lights flew over, and they carried misty chaotic chi. Such a force was even sufficient to terrify gods. Xianxia had nowhere to evade it. In the end, he gritted his teeth and took the risk of injury as he dove while breaking through these attacks with the talisman armament in his hand. Rumble! In the end, he passed through them successfully. However, a hole had still been torn open on his chest, causing fresh blood to gurgle out, and it had almost penetrated his heart. It was extremely dangerous. When one was within this passageway towards the last day's domain, there was usually only two possibilities. One would either be swallowed and annihilated by the extremely enormous vortex or utilize one's entire strength to traverse through the vortex. There was no other possibility besides these two. Swoosh! 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 The vortex revolved and emanated a myriad of gray and hazy strands of flowing light. The extremely strong tearing force of the vortex caused this passageway to warp, collapse, and transform into a chaotic flow of space. It seemed as if it intended to mince everything into pieces. Xianxia's figure flickered. He didn't go head-on against it, and he instead followed along the force of the vortex to move forward. At the same time, he relied on the method of circulating the Devour Tao insight to deal with the devouring force from the vortex. As an extraordinary existence at the God rank realm that had grasped numerous supreme grand Taos, Xianxia's control of energy had already arrived at an unbelievable state. The tearing and warping force of the vortex was unable to trap him, and the only thing that was troublesome to him were those gray and hazy strands of flowing lights that shot over without end. Rumble! This expanse of chaotic space shook violently. Space exploded into pieces while even more energy sprayed and surged out from the vortex. Countless strands of flowing light and chaotic chi shot out, and the situation became even more dangerous. Strange, this vortex seems to be targeting me. Could it be that it has a will of its own? The situation was becoming worse, and it caused Xianxia to be unable to help but feel anxious and bewildered. He faintly felt that there seemed to be something wrong with this situation, and it was like he'd fallen into an ambush that had been prepared for him. Rumble. After a short moment, the expanse of gray and hazy flowing light converged and transformed into a zigzagged bolt of chaotic lightning, and it carried terrifying divine radiance as it struck down. This sort of might was extremely terrifying, and it was beyond anything he'd seen in the past. Once he was struck by it, then even if he was an expert at the godrank realm, he would be immediately annihilated while his body would be blasted into pieces. Break! At this instant, Xianxia suddenly shouted loudly, and a bang resounded as he utilized the copper coin of Treasurefall. 3 bright golden copper coins glowed and formed the shape of a character before circling around his body. At practically the exact same moment, Xianxia's figure flashed abruptly, and he tore through the obstruction of numerous waves of attacks and passed through this dangerous area before entering the vortex. Violent sounds of explosions resounded from behind him. The chaos split open while divine radiance covered the surroundings. This area had fallen completely into disorder and collapsed, and it formed an extremely terrifying chaotic flow of energy. Bang! Xianxia felt as if his back was fiercely smashed by a myriad of mountains. The bones in his entire body almost collapsed into pieces, and then a strand of blood rose through his throat and seeped out from the corner of his mouth. After that, rumbling resounded as his figure flew like a rocket towards the depths of the vortex. After a short moment, with an enormous chaotic vortex, a bang resounded as a figure staggered out from within it. "I've finally gotten out of there." A wisp of happiness was revealed on Xianxia's slightly pale face, and he felt lucky to have survived the calamity while his entire body felt relaxed. All of that from before was like a nightmare that was dangerous and terrifying, and it was even more dangerous than fighting experts at the godrank realm, because all of that was mysterious and formidable. It warped space and collapsed chaos, and if one's luck was slightly bad, then one would absolutely perish there. Even gods were unable to survive it. Last day's domain. I've arrived. Xianxia took a deep breath while the injuries that covered his entire body healed at an unbelievable rate, and his gaze shot towards the surroundings. This was an extremely vast expanse of wilderness. The sky was a misty azure while the ground rose and fell with mountains, and towering ancient trees filled the surroundings. Moreover, the air was suffused with strands of obscure chaotic chi. A prey from the lower dimensions was actually able to escape calamity? It looks to me like he was just lucky. Young master, there's no need to be impatient. I'll go capture that prey right now. Right when Xianxia was sizing up the surroundings, a wave of voices suddenly resounded in this expanse of the heavens and the earth. Prey from the lower dimensions? Young master? Xianxia was shocked in his heart while his pupils suddenly constricted. At this instant, he immediately understood that everything he experienced earlier had been witnessed by these people. In other words, they were waiting for prey to arrive, since the moment he entered the vortex. Swish! Right at this moment, a wave of fluctuation arose in the distant space, and then an extremely dazzling crimson-colored ray of divine light tore the heavens and the earth apart and shattered space as it shot over explosively. Shockingly, it was a divine arrow. The body of the arrow was coiled by strands of the glow of divinity. It was extremely dazzling and resplendent, and it emanated an all-powerful and terrifying imposing aura. Woo, woo, woo. At this instant, the heavens and the earth dimmed down while the sound of fiend gods wailing arose. All of this was caused by that crimson divine arrow. Bang! The crimson-red divine arrow tore through the sky and through the wind and clouds in the surroundings into chaos. In an instant, every hair on Xianxia's body stood on end, and his entire vital energy had been locked onto by a formidable and terrifying will. This was an effect that could only be obtained by attaining terrifying attainments in the Tao of archery. No matter how one teleported, so long as one's vital energy was locked onto, then it would be utterly impossible to evade the attack of that terrifying arrow. Obviously, this person that attacked him abruptly was a master archer. Since this person was able to utilize his cultivation in the Tao of archery to lock onto an existence at the God-rank realm like Xianxia, it was obvious how shocking the attainments of this person's cultivation in the Tao of archery was. Humph! Right at this critical moment, Xianxia suddenly grunted coldly, while divine radiance erupted from his eyes. And then the Tao seal mark that enveloped the surroundings of his soul divine flame shook abruptly. Bang! It seemed as if an invisible will had been crushed and severed, and the will that locked onto Xianxia's vital energy had instantly been dispersed. Swoosh! At practically the exact same time, Xianxia's figure flashed lightly to barely avoid the attack of that crimson divine arrow. Rumble! The crimson divine arrow missed and smashed fiercely onto the ground behind Xianxia. It actually broke open a bottom rift, and within the rift, the aura of divinity raged and minced everything into pieces. The might of a single arrow was actually terrifying to such an extent. An exclaim of surprise sounded out from afar, and it seemed as if that person had never imagined that Xianxia would actually be able to avoid this attack. Right at this moment, Xianxia's enormous will swept out. In an instant, he noticed the enemies that were hunting him on an expanse of wilderness 5,000 kilometers away. It was a group of people over there, and it was a curly-bearded old man who bared his upper body and held a longbow made of a beast bone that had attacked him. The old man was 27 m tall, and the muscles on his entire body seemed as if they were cast from iron and were filled with explosive force, causing him to seem extremely ferocious. Moreover, there was a divine bow tattoo on his face. His entire body was like a lofty and immovable mountain, and he was enveloped by a strand of extremely terrifying divinity. There was a white-robed young man and a group of elite and cold guards at the old man's side. Obviously, the white-robed young man was the core figure amongst them. Who were these fellows? Could it be that they're from the ancient god domain? Thoughts flashed within Xianxia's heart because the auras emanated by them allowed him to determine that they were obviously not from the sovereign sect. This meant that they were either cultivators that lived in the last days domain or had come from the ancient god domain. All of you waited here for prey to arrive and even took me to be your prey. How arrogant and unbridled of them. Xianxia's expression was icy cold, and a wisp of bone-deep coldness surged out from his eyes. Ninth uncle, the strength of this prey from the lower dimensions isn't bad. I want to capture him to be my godslave and order him about for eternity. The white-robed young man spoke casually, and he revealed a strand of extreme arrogance. Young master, since you like him, then I'll spare his life and capture him alive for you. Bang! 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 Wave after wave of the sound of space being blasted apart resounded as numerous crimson divine arrows shot over explosively once more, and they were like rays of light that shot through the sky, shattered space, and were peerlessly sharp. The 27 m tall and ferocious old man that stood 5,000 kilometers away had attacked once more with the beast bone longbow. In an instant, he'd successively shot out 9 divine arrows, and they seemed like a string of stars that enveloped the surroundings and firmly locked onto Xianxia's paths of retreat. Prey? Godslave? A wisp of killing intent surged out from Xianxia's heart. When he was in the 3 dimensions, he was respectfully addressed as the number 1 expert in the 3 dimensions, and he received the respect of all. Moreover, his status was peerlessly lofty. Yet now, as soon as he arrived at the last day's domain, he'd suffered such humiliation, and it had exceeded the limits Xianxia was able to tolerate. Clang! The talisman armament soared through the sky as Xianxia's figure flashed, and divinity surged and circulated throughout his body as he slashed. Bang! A crimson divine arrow that was the first to arrive was accurately struck at the tip by Xianxia's sword strike. The collision between the two caused divine radiance to erupt and suffused the sky. After that, the crimson divine arrow shattered with a bang and transformed into a rain of light that scattered into the surroundings. On the other hand, Xianxia's entire body was struck to the point of shaking, and the vital blood within his entire body roiled. What a terrifying might in the Tao of archery! Even though this old fellow's cultivation in the Tao of archery has only attained the archer god realm, His own cultivation has probably already attained the domain enlightened spirit god realm. Xianxia's eyes narrowed. The realm above the world enlightened true god realm was the domain enlightened spirit god realm. In this realm, one had already built a domain enlightened divine altar, with the foundation of the soul divine flame and grasped domain energy. Bang! 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 Thoughts flashed within Xianxia's heart while his actions didn't stop at all. He utilized the talisman armament to slash apart the remaining 8 crimson divine arrows that tore through the sky towards him, and it caused wave after wave of terrifying and explosive torrents to sweep out towards the surroundings, causing mountains to collapse, space to be thrown into disorder, and the ground to be reduced into ruins. After he finished doing all of this, the vital blood within Xianxia's body was surging, and the bones within his entire body were struck to the point of trembling. The force of those arrows were too terrifying, and it caused him to actually suffer a small loss in such a head-on collision. This last day's domain really is dangerous to the extreme, and it's like treading on thin ice even for existences at the god rank realm. Xianxia sighed in his heart, and he obtained a deeper understanding of how abnormal the last day's domain was. That prey from the lower dimensions actually blocked Ninth Uncle's divine arrow chain. Xianxia was surprised and bewildered in his heart. But the white-robed young man and the others 5,000 kilometers away were even more surprised than he was. They seemed to have never imagined that they would actually be unable to capture Xianxia under such circumstances. Ninth Uncle, this god-slave is mine. I'll be participating in Empress Yuche's Star Hunt meeting 3 months from now, and I just happen to lack a comparatively formidable slave at the world-enlightened true god realm. I think he'll do fine. The white-robed young man smiled brightly with an overbearing gaze, and his voice carried an ordering and indisputable tone. Young master, this prey from the lower dimensions can't be taken back to Snow Ink region. We can only sell him off to the lackeys of the sovereign sect, and allow them to send him to unexplored regions to reclaim wastelands and mine for the sake of establishing new territories for our god domain. The ferocious old man was slightly hesitant. It's only some lackeys from the sovereign sect, and it isn't their sect master or god exalt that's there. I believe that Ninth Uncle will definitely have a way to help me accomplish this. Right? The white-robed young man glanced at the ferocious old man with an indifferent expression. The heart of the old man addressed as Ninth Uncle trembled instead, and he hurriedly nodded in agreement. He was clearly aware that this young master of his seemed to be harmless in appearance, yet was actually extremely resolute and ruthless in heart. Moreover, the white-robed young man was extremely cruel, so he didn't dare disobey the young man. Shit! That prey intends to flee. Meanwhile, the group of guards shouted loudly as they'd noticed that Xianxia was fleeing. Humph! All of you take good care of the young master. I'll go capture him. A divine glow flashed within his eyes, and then a swish resounded as his 27 tall figure vanished on the spot. What a vigilant prey! He was actually able to block Ninth Uncle's divine arrow chain with a cultivation at the world-enlightened true god realm. Such a strength is truly rare. If I capture him as a god-slave and take him to participate in the Star Hunt meeting, he'll definitely be able to win a great deal of prizes for me. The white-robed young man smiled in a leisurely manner, and he seemed extremely complacent, as if everything was within his grasp. Xianxia had indeed fled. He's just arrived at the last day's domain and was still in the dark about everything here. He didn't know anything, so he didn't have the slightest mood to fight with those fellows. Not to mention that their group had a master archer at the domain enlightened spirit god realm present amongst them, and it caused him to feel extremely fearful. He was unwilling to take a risk at such a time. Of course, Xianxia would naturally not forget this enmity, and once he got a good grasp of the situation here, he would naturally have all sorts of methods to get revenge for everything he suffered today. Swoosh! Space surged as Xianxia's figure flew at full speed within it, and his entire figure was like a wisp of flowing light that flickered endlessly in the boundless wilderness. Besides that old man, there are another world-enlightened true gods in that group that are acting as guards for that white-robed young man. But it just so happens that the white-robed young man is only at the Immortal King realm. Looks like his identity is definitely extraordinary. Xianxia pondered in his heart as he flew with extreme haste. When his third senior brother, Tai Yunhai, fourth senior brother, the old scholar, senior sister Li Yang, and the others headed to the last day's domain. They brought along Dian Dian, Shenyuan Shao, Shenyuan Tabiai, and other immortal kings with them. So he wasn't surprised when he determined that the white-robed young man had come to the last day's domain while at the immortal king realm. The thing that truly surprised him was that the white-robed young man was actually able to possess a master archer at the domain enlightened spirit god realm as a servant and six-world enlightened true gods as lackeys. This wasn't something that just anyone could accomplish. In the three dimensions, the forces possessed by this white-robed young man was simply beyond imagination. Exactly what sort of existence is this last day's domain? With this understanding, Xianxia was filled with even stronger curiosity towards this place that was filled with danger and mystery. Suddenly, Xianxia's heart shook as a trace of a warning arose within it. Swish! A crimson divine arrow tore through the sky, and it was peerlessly swift and powerful. It even tore apart an extremely narrow and long rift in space, and nothing could obstruct it. Clang! This strike was too swift and domineering like thunder. It shot through space and caused Xianxia to be unable to dodge it, and he could only turn around and utilize the talisman armament to slash down fiercely. The sword and arrow collided, causing rumbling to resound as a myriad of energy torrents erupted towards the surroundings. On the other hand, the figure of that old man called Ninth Elder had seized this opportunity to appear 500 kilometers away. The skin on his bare upper body revealed numerous bulging muscles that were hard like rocks, and they were suffused with divine radiance. He held the beast bone longbow and seemed like an arrogant deity. He locked onto Xianxia yet didn't attack hastily, and he said in a deep voice instead, "Little bastard from the lower dimensions, no matter how revered your identity was in the lower dimensions, but so long as you've arrived at the last day's domain, you're merely like an ant. Out of consideration towards the difficulties you experienced to cultivate to such an extent, I can give you a chance to survive." Oh! Xianxia's eyes narrowed. "So long as you surrender to my young master now and swear to follow by his side as a god-slave, then not only would I spare your life, I can even bring you out of this last day's domain to head to Snow Ink region." Nine Uncle spoke indifferently, and every single move he made revealed an aura of supremacy. Snow Ink region? Xianxia thought in his heart. Could it be that it's a region within the ancient god domain? What do you think? You can consider it for a moment. This is an extremely rare and enormous fortune. Since the ancient times until now, all the gods that entered the last day's domain from the various planes had either perished here or were restrained and reduced to slaves that were sent to unexplored regions to reclaim territories for our god domain. They practically have a very slim chance of survival, and only a mere few are lucky enough to survive. Very few people are able to possess such extraordinarily great fortune. Ninth Uncle spoke in an unhurried manner before he stopped speaking completely. He was a domain-enlightened spirit god and had given such extremely tempting conditions, so he didn't believe that the young man before him would be able to refuse. The last day's domain was dangerous and mysterious, so the gods that were restrained and brought in here did indeed have a very slim chance at survival. Only a small handful of them were able to locate the passageway that led to the ancient god domain and emerge safe and sound. All of this was something he'd heard a long time ago from his senior sister, Li Yang, in the three dimensions. However, this didn't mean that Xianxia would put down his dignity for the sake of entering the ancient god domain and be reduced to a slave by someone's side. Was doing this any different from giving up the grand Tao one pursued? So as soon as Ninth Uncle finished speaking, Xianxia didn't hesitate at all to speak in an extremely cold tone. "Great fortune? It looks to me like you've become accustomed to being a slave, and you deserve to serve others for your entire life." Ninth Uncle's face sank while a cold glow erupted from his eyes. Never had he imagined that this young man would actually dare to insult his dignity. He took a deep breath and said, "Young man, you've just arrived at the last day's domain, and you have an exaggerated opinion of your ability, so I won't blame you for this. However, if you still refuse to realize your mistakes, then don't blame me for killing you." Clang! Xianxia raised the talisman armament and pointed it at Ninth Uncle from afar, and he revealed killing intent as he said, "Old bastard, I forgot to tell you that I, Xianxia, would rather have my backbone broken than bow to anyone." Swish! As he spoke, his figure flashed, and the talisman armament was like a dazzling, scorching sun that soared into the sky and carried vast divine radiance as he attacked. This old man possessed supreme attainments in the Tao of archery and a cultivation at the domain enlightened spirit god realm. It was practically impossible for Xianxia to kill the old man with his current ability. After all, there was an entire realm between them. The difference in realm caused the might they could exert to be completely different. It was like the difference between a saint immortal and an immortal king, and it was utterly impossible to surmount. Even if Xianxia was confident that his strength was sufficient to face any enemy at the world-enlightened true god realm, it didn't represent that he was able to surmount a realm and do battle now or even annihilate a domain-enlightened spirit god that was at a higher realm. However, even though he wasn't confident in his ability to kill the old man, Xianxia was confident that he possessed the strength to fight the old man and not be oppressed at will. Especially when he was dealing with an expert in the Tao of archery, and he would only be able to obtain a certain degree of advantage through close-quarter combat. So as soon as he attacked, he decided to fight at close quarters. "Humph! You're impossible!" Ninth Uncle grunted coldly before his figure suddenly flashed, and then a pair of pitch-black wings actually floated up into appearance on his back. Divine radiance surged on the wings while the figure of an ancient fiend god floated up into appearance, and it emanated a strand of extremely terrifying and deterring force. Heavenly Spirit Wings. It was a grand divine ability that possessed supreme divine might, and it was inherited from the primeval fiend god, Dei. According to legend, during the primeval times, Dei relied on the support of the heavenly spirit wings and supreme attainments in the Tao of archery to hunt and kill 9 natural fiend gods that were born from within the chaos sun crows. Swoosh! With a flap of his wings, Ninth Uncle's entire body suddenly vanished, and it caused Xianxia's attack to miss. How swift! Xianxia's expression changed slightly, and he instantly sensed that the old man's figure had actually already appeared 50,000 kilometers away. "Young man, I've already given you a chance. Unfortunately, you didn't cherish it." Ninth Uncle's cold and deep voice resounded in the heavens and the earth. After that, bang, bang, bang. Numerous crimson divine arrows tore through the sky and space, and they were peerlessly powerful and possessed the terrifying might to penetrate and obliterate the world. All of this actually shot over explosively from 50,000 kilometers away. This obviously showed how terrifying a master archer was because they were able to accurately lock onto one's vital energy before hunting and killing from an extremely far distance and through numerous layers of space. The facts were indeed so. In terms of combat strength, the Sword Tao was the deserving holder of the title of Strongest Tao, but in terms of ability to hunt and kill, it was the Tao of archery that reigned supreme. It was even to the extent that master archers were existences that cultivators usually feared the most. Because once one was targeted by one, then it would absolutely cause one to be unable to eat or sleep in peace, as it was impossible to know when one would suffer a surprise attack from the master archer. In an instant, Xianxia noticed that his vital energy had been locked onto from all directions, and he was unable to dodge or flee. However, Xianxia grunted coldly instead, and then the Tao seal mark within his sea of consciousness seethed and minced all of this into pieces with a bang. After that, his figure flashed as he flew once more towards the distance, and he easily avoided the numerous divine arrows that tore through the sky towards him. "Old bastard, since you don't have the balls to fight me head-on, then I'll be bidding my farewell." Xianxia teleported like a rock, and he knocked apart open layer of space and teleported at full speed. It wasn't that he wasn't skilled in long-distance combat, but choosing to have a long-distance battle with a master archer at this moment was absolutely the stupidest choice he could make. Since it was like that, and he was unable to enter into close-quarter combat as well, then the best choice was to take the initiative to flee. This kid can actually struggle free from my lock-on? Could it be that he possesses a divine artifact with some sort of unfathomable might? Ninth Uncle's pupils constricted, and he was slightly surprised and bewildered. As a master archer, he possessed a supreme secret technique of the soul, and it supplemented his Tao of archery. He was able to lock onto any target within an area of 500,000 kilometers, and it had never failed. Locking onto one's vital energy was an ability that an expert in the Tao of archery had to possess, and once a master archer was unable to lock onto the tracks of the enemy, then no matter how terrifying the master archer's cultivation in the Tao of archery was, how could the master archer possibly hit the enemy? This was a problem of accuracy. To an expert in the Tao of archery, locking onto one's vital energy was the precondition to killing the enemy in one shot, and without this precondition, everything would be done in vain. As an existence that had attained the archer god realm in the Tao of archery and a domain enlightened spirit god, Ninth Uncle had failed successively. This caused waves to surge in his heart, and his heart was unable to calm down. If Xianxia's cultivation far exceeded his own, then it was understandable. But it just so happened that Xianxia's cultivation was only at the world enlightened true god realm, so how could Ninth Uncle accept this? This kid really is extremely strange. No wonder young master took a fancy to him with a single glance and desired to take him as a godslave to participate in Empress Wuxia's Star Hunt meeting. It's very rare even in Snow Ink region's 3,000 universes for someone to possess such ability at the world enlightened true god realm. Thoughts flashed within his heart, yet Ninth Uncle didn't stop moving at all. The heavenly spirit wings on his back flashed and emanated a wave of terrifying rumbling before he instantly moved to pursue Xianxia. After a short while, Ninth Uncle locked onto Xianxia's vital energy once again, and then he nocked an arrow. He exerted strength with his arm while his entire body was suffused with divine radiance, and he emanated a strand of terrifying, imposing aura and was like a primeval god that intended to hunt the scorching sun in the sky. This time, he'd utilized his entire strength, and he'd practically utilized the entire cultivation in the Tao of archery that he possessed. However, before he could release this arrow, Xianxia's figure had vanished once more from his detection. Damn it! How could this be possible? Ninth Uncle's pupils constricted. His arrow was already on the bowstring, yet he forcefully restrained it from being shot out. A world-enlightened true god that had entered the last day's domain from the lower dimensions had successively escaped his lock-on, and this was extremely unusual. Most importantly, if this situation continued, then his entire cultivation in the Tao of archery would be utterly impossible to utilize. How exactly did he accomplish this? Ninth Uncle's expression was extremely gloomy, yet his heart was filled with surprise and bewilderment. He'd lived for countless years and experienced innumerable battles, yet it was still the first time that he'd encountered such a strange situation while dealing with a world-enlightened true god. Swoosh! He gritted his teeth and pursued Xianxia once more. This time, he'd changed his strategy. He'd given up on utilizing the Tao of archery, and he intended to rely on his superior cultivation to crush Xianxia. This Tao seal mark really is extraordinary. It's like an armor for the soul, yet it just happens to not be a divine artifact. Moreover, it can be utilized at will, and it can even sever any form of lock-on of the vital energy. In this way, it's entirely capable of allowing me to avoid all sorts of dangers. Xianxia sighed with emotion in his heart as he flickered repeatedly through space and flew with extreme haste. At this moment, he'd long since lost track of where he'd flown to. However, he couldn't be bothered about all of that because a domain-enlightened spirit god was pursuing him from behind, so he couldn't be bothered about anything at all while he was in such a situation. That old fellow actually caught up. Swoosh! Xianxia suddenly stopped. He was very clearly aware that the old man's speed of teleportation was more than double his own. If the old man gave up on hunting and killing him from long distance and chose close-quarter combat instead, then it was useless no matter how desperately he fled. Young man, you really are extraordinary. Ninth Uncle strode through the air and arrived here, and the heavenly spirit wings behind him flapped as he stood 50 kilometers away from Xianxia. He stared at Xianxia with a gloomy expression and said, "Tell me how you avoided my lock-on of your vital energy, and I'll give you another chance and spare your life. Old bastard. Why do you keep spouting a bunch of nonsense?" Xianxia grunted coldly, and he held the talisman armament in hand as he directly slashed it down towards the old man. They were only 50 kilometers away from each other, and now this sort of distance was no different than closed-quarter combat to Xianxia. Swish! Sword insight surged and transformed into numerous divine talisman diagrams that illuminated the world, and they carried a terrifying energy of the sword Tao as they descended ferociously towards the old man. You're courting death. Ninth uncle was utterly enraged. With a grabbing motion of the hand, a bronze spear floated up into appearance before he charged to greet Xianxia's attack head-on. Rumble. The sword insight collided with the spear and instantly transformed the ground in an area of 50,000 kilometers into ruins. A scene of desolation covered the ground, and not a single intact thing could be found. Stomp! 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 Xianxia's figure was struck by a strand of terrifying and enormous force to the point of taking 3 steps back in space. However, he wasn't terrified but delighted by this instead. This old man was most skilled in the Tao of archery, and now that the old man had given up on utilizing it and chosen close-quarter combat instead, this was no different than the old man's severing his own arm. On the other hand, this just happened to be the best situation for Xianxia to utilize his strength, because he was skilled in close-quarter combat, whereas the old man was not, and this advantage was sufficient to offset a certain amount of the gap between their cultivations. Swish! Without any hesitation, Xianxia flashed over once more. Before he arrived at the last day's domain, Xianxia had been constantly comprehending the profundities within the diagram of the bloodied, damaged sword, and he'd already faintly showed signs of breaking through. Now, with the absolute pressure he suffered when facing a formidable opponent that far exceeded his cultivation realm, Xianxia was even confident that so long as he persisted for a period of time, then his cultivation in the sword Tao might be able to break through in one go. Kill! At this moment, Xianxia had discarded all the distracting thoughts in his mind, and both his mind and heart were immersed in the battle as he executed all the techniques in the sword Tao that he'd comprehended to attack the old man. Humph! You little bastard that has an exaggerated opinion of your ability. I'll allow you to understand today what a difference in cultivation realm is. Ninth uncle was utterly enraged from being repeatedly provoked by Xianxia, and he'd aroused killing intent as he suddenly shouted loudly. He seemed like an enraged ancient fiend god that intended to obliterate the world. Rumble! The battle erupted, and Xianxia held the talisman armament in hand as he fought the old man head-on. In an instant, this expanse of the heavens and the earth were filled with terrifying divinity, causing all things to be obliterated, while terrifying chaotic flows of energy raged like gales as they spread towards the surroundings. Kill! Xianxia's dense long hair fluttered as he traversed through space like a god of the sword, and he utilized the talisman armament to the limit, causing an enormous glow to arise from it while countless divine talisman diagrams whistled through the sky and smashed down towards the old man. Strictly speaking, this was Xianxia's first battle since stepping foot into the world-enlightened true god realm. Moreover, his opponent was even a domain-enlightened spirit god whose cultivation surpassed his own by a realm. If it was any other person in Xianxia's place, that person would have probably fled since a long time ago when facing such a situation, because how would one fight when one's cultivation was suppressed? But Xianxia didn't flee. Firstly, he was extremely confident towards his own combat strength, and secondly, it was because the old man had given up on utilizing the Tao of archery that he was most skilled at and chosen closed-quartered combat instead. This was undoubtedly like utilizing something one was weak at against the strength of an opponent, and it caused his deterrent force towards Xianxia to reduce greatly. Even if the pressure he caused Xianxia was still extremely great, it was precisely this heavy pressure that aroused the unyielding spirit within Xianxia, and he intended to rely on the tempering of this battle to break through into the Sword Emperor realm in one go. However, when he truly started the battle with the old man, Xianxia finally understood how terrifying the might of a domain-enlightened spirit god was. Bang! Space was shattered into pieces as a bronze spear that was suffused with divine radiance shot towards him, and it was peerlessly sharp and seemed to intend to annihilate everything. Xianxia dodged with all his might, yet a strand of his long hair was still sliced off by the sharp aura of the spear, and it was only inches away from penetrating his head. This caused his eyes to focus, and he didn't be careless in the slightest. Swoosh! 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 Strand after strand of sword chi tore through the sky, and all of these strands of sword chi came from the profundities of the diagram of the bloody, damaged sword. It was mysterious, unfathomable, and filled with extremely pure killing intent of the sword Tao, and it had already faintly exceeded the limits attainable by the sword god realm. A divine glow flashed within Ninth Uncle's eyes as he seemed to have noticed something. He swung the bronze spear in his hand, causing numerous violent spear images to shoot out, and they emanated deafening sounds of explosions as they blocked off all the strands of sword chi that covered the sky. However, his entire body was shaken by this attack to the point his entire aura roiled, and his 27 tall and ferocious figure even trembled imperceptibly a few times. How formidable! What sort of sword Tao is this? Even though this kid's cultivation is low, his grasp of the sword Tao has actually attained perfection in the sword god realm, and it's even to the extent that it's even a trace stronger than that. He really is an extraordinary genius. When did such a little freak appear within the lower dimensions? In an instant, numerous thoughts flickered within Ninth Uncle's heart, and he realized how extraordinary Xianxia was. Swoosh! Meanwhile, Xianxia had attacked once more. Every single pore on his entire body seemed to be suffused with extremely sharp sword chi, and they whistled and seethed while descending to the world with might that grew more and more stronger. If this kid can't be of use to the young master, then he must be killed. Otherwise, he'll probably become quite a huge calamity in the future. Ninth Uncle didn't dare allow his thoughts to run wild, and killing intent shot out from his heart. He shouted loudly as the bronze spear tore through the sky, and he moved to intercept Xianxia's attack. Young man, your cultivation realm is too low. Even though your sword Tao is formidable, your grasp of the divine Tao is merely at the basics. Under such circumstances, it's utterly impossible for you to be a match for me. As he fought, Ninth Uncle said, so long as you allow yourself to be captured now, then the conditions I promised you earlier will still stand. Not only will I bring you to the ancient god domain, if you perform well, I can even bestow some books on the divine Tao to you, and it'll be sufficient to allow you to grow quickly. Geezer, there's no need to waste your breath. I'm clearly aware of how I should walk on my own path towards the Tao, and I don't need you to tell me what to do. Xianxia's attacks grew even swifter and fiercer, and he seemed as if he'd resolved to fight the old man to the bitter end. What an impenetrably thick-headed little fellow. You're simply stupid to the extreme. Ninth Uncle started laughing from extreme rage, and he'd completely abandoned any trace of intent in his heart to draw Xianxia over to his young master's side. He stopped holding back and attacked with his entire strength, as he'd already decided to annihilate Xianxia on the spot and eliminate all future troubles. Bang! The bronze spear tore through the sky. In an instant, it emanated the divine radiance of the 5 elements, and 5 different energies of divine Tao laws actually took form and condensed into a world that intended to restrain and crush Xianxia. This was the might of divine Tao laws. When utilized by a domain-enlightened spirit god, a world could be created with a single thought, and it was capable of annihilating a world. A domain-enlightened spirit god could be said to be capable of changing the world. The divine Tao laws was the grand Tao profundities possessed by the gods. It was also called the Tao of gods, and it was an even more advanced force of Tao insight. Such a force was divided in 5 stages, namely the basic stage, initial stage, advanced stage, peak stage, and perfection stage. Every single stage was a type of transformation, and it was like the difference between the heavens and the earth. To an ordinary god, cultivating through these 5 stages to attain perfection in their own divine Tao was practically something unreachable, because surmounting every single stage was extremely difficult. Even if one spent an extremely long period of time comprehending it, if one didn't possess the required natural talent and comprehension ability, it was utterly impossible to accomplish. In other words, because the lifespans of the gods were seemingly eternal, time had already become a trivial existence on the path towards seeking the divine Tao. If one desired to improve on one's path towards the Tao, then it entirely depended on one's own comprehension ability, natural talent, fortune, will, and various other aspects. For example, the talisman divine Tao that Xianxia possessed now could only be considered to be at the basic stage. On the other hand, Ninth Uncle had already attained the initial stage in the 5-element divine Tao since a long time ago, so he naturally possessed an unshakable suppressive effect towards Xianxia's divine Tao. So, even if he'd abandoned the Tao of archery that he was most skilled in, but by relying on his superior cultivation and divine Tao that had attained the initial stage, he was still confident in being able to annihilate Xianxia. Something worthy of mentioning was that if one desired to determine whose respective divine Tao was more formidable, then besides the difference in the stages of attainment in the divine Tao, it depended on the properties contained within the respective divine Taos. Just like the various ordinary grand Taos like the 5 elements, yin-yang, and tempest, each of them possessed varying strengths, yet they were only ordinary divine Tao laws. On the other hand, light, darkness, eternal, creation, devour, all of these divine Taos were rare and top-rate divine Taos, and they naturally suppressed other ordinary divine Taos. As for exactly which amongst them was the most formidable, it still depended on the comprehensive strength of their respective owners. Rumble. As soon as ninth uncle attacked, he utilized his divine Tao to condense a world of the 5 elements, and he intended to restrain and crush Xianxia with it. Moreover, its brilliant might caused even the heavens and the earth to dim down. In an instant, Xianxia sensed that he was utterly unable to avoid this attack, and he could only go head-on against it. Moreover, once he failed, then he would fall into a situation where he was completely suppressed. The situation was extremely dangerous. However, it was precisely under the stimulation of such danger that Xianxia's black eyes grew brighter and brighter, while every single inch of his skin seemed to be burning and glowing, and he seemed eager to battle. Moreover, countless types of comprehensions in the Sword Tao had surged out within his heart. There were all the comprehensions he'd obtained throughout his path of cultivation. There was all the myriad of Sword Tao techniques he'd comprehended from books. There was the experience in the Sword Tao that he'd obtained through the tempering of countless battles. In the end, all of these comprehensions, techniques, and experiences were reflected within the diagram of the bloodied, damaged sword, and it ceaselessly amplified and formed within his heart. Swoosh! Under the effect of this sort of indescribable and miraculous comprehension, Xianxia practically instinctively slashed out with his sword. Rumble! The heavens and the earth transformed abruptly while the clouds and wind surged, and even space was silently torn apart. A strand of sword chi that was filled with an obscure aura and carried an all-powerful might shot out. Shit! How could this kid's sword Tao possibly become so much more formidable in an instant? Ninth uncle was shocked in his heart, and his expression changed. He suddenly utilized the heavenly spirit wings to dodge extremely far away with a swish. Bang! At practically the exact same moment, that strand of sword chi instantly slashed that world of 5 elements into 2, and then it rumbled as it collapsed and was obliterated. When he saw this scene, Ninth Uncle's expression became surprised and bewildered. Could it be the Sword Emperor realm? When he thought of this title, his heart couldn't help but tremble. The Sword Emperor realm. Such a realm of cultivation in the Sword Tao can be said to be peerless in the world. Within the 3,000 universes of Snow Ink region, it's only possible for a Sword Emperor to be born amongst those almighty figures that had already attained the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm since a long time ago, and the amount of them is pitiably few. But how could such a cultivation in the Sword Tao possibly be executed by a little fellow at the world-enlightened true god realm? Destroying the 5 elements with a single strike, this sword strike will be called the 5-element annihilator. As he sensed the might of this strike, Xianxia muttered in his heart. But right after that, he couldn't be bothered to give it any further thought because his comprehension towards the Sword Tao was still improving without end, and it was ceaselessly being deduced and transforming. Damn it! This kid's imposing aura is growing more and more ferocious. It seems as if he's undergoing a shocking transformation. When he noticed the changes in Xianxia's aura, Ninth Uncle's expression instantly became extremely gloomy, and he was utterly furious. He'd finally realized that he'd actually unknowingly become a whetstone for Xianxia's Sword Tao. Little bastard! I won't allow you to succeed, Ninth Uncle roared furiously. His figure was like an ancient fiend god as it soared through the sky, and the muscles in his entire body surged with terrifying divinity as he attacked explosively once again with the bronze spear in hand. Rumble! The spear tore through the sky while coiled with numerous strands of divine radiance of the 5 elements, and it caused the images of numerous gods to float into appearance. Moreover, there was even numerous peerlessly grand voices of the gods carried along with this attack. Its might was so formidable that it could be said to be boundless. Beneath the might of this attack, Xianxia's dense long hair was blown back, and it caused the skin on his entire body to hurt. It was like a myriad of awls were being pierced into his body. Yet this was merely caused by the imposing aura of this strike. Obviously, Ninth Uncle's entire strength had been utilized in this strike, and it was a formidable blow that he executed in an enraged state. However, it was precisely during such a situation that Xianxia's expression still remained strangely calm and composed. Only his pair of black eyes that seemed like two abysses were growing more and more bright, more and more blazing, and it was like a pair of scorching suns were burning within them. Swoosh! He executed another sword strike, and it was extremely ordinary and simple. However, right at this instant, everything within this expanse of the heavens and the earth fell into deathly silence. Everything in the world was terrified, and only a sword howl resounded like the roar of a dragon, and even more like the tune of a supreme divine Tao. Bang! A sound of collision that shook the heavens and the earth resounded. This expanse of the sky was blasted into countless pieces that crashed to the ground in succession while the landscape collapsed completely and shot towards the surroundings. On the other hand, beneath the might of this strike, Ninth Uncle's figure that was mighty like a mountain staggered back uncontrollably, and he was struck to the point his arms had gone numb. Moreover, the bronze spear in his hand trembled violently, and it had almost flown out from his grasp. Damn it! Ninth Uncle took a deep breath while forcefully restraining the impulse. He had to cough up a mouthful of blood. This strand of sword chi was too terrifying, and it had almost injured his internal organs. If it wasn't for his cultivation far exceeding Xianxia by a realm, then merely this strike alone was something he would be unable to resist. This little bastard's cultivation in the sword Tao is transforming, and if I don't stop him, then I'll probably really be unable to deal with him today. A divine glow flickered in Ninth Uncle's eyes while killing intent coiled around them. His strongest attack was actually unable to injure Xianxia, and it was him instead that was shaken to the point of almost suffering an injury. This allowed him to fully understand that the situation had suddenly become slightly bad. Bang! Ninth Uncle didn't dare hesitate. He raised the bronze spear and roared furiously as he shot over explosively while carrying divine radiance that covered the sky. He was absolutely unable to watch helplessly as Xianxia transformed successfully, nor was he able to accept the occurrence of a situation where Xianxia had safely escaped from him. This sword strike reveals eternality within the ordinary, a thunderclap within silence. It's like raging waves arising on the clear blue ocean and giving rise to a myriad of layers of force. I can take it to be my second sword move after attaining the divine Tao calm before the storm. Xianxia seemed to be lost in thought, and he was immersed in the transformation of his sword Tao. With the first sword strike, he destroyed the world of 5 elements condensed by the old man, and it was the most destructive. Thus, he named it 5-element Annihilator. With the second sword strike, he'd eradicated the old man's attacks and blasted the old man back, and it was the most forceful and oppressive. Thus, he named it Calm Before the Storm. These 2 sword moves had both came from the sword Tao profundities that he'd comprehended and incorporated at this moment. They were filled with the profundities of the divine Tao, and they were a type of probe towards his path towards the sword Tao. Moreover, they already possessed the supreme and grand aura of the Sword Emperor realm. This isn't enough. My sword Tao can still become even stronger. At this moment, under the strong and oppressive pressure from the old man, Xianxia had completely grasped the trace of opportunity to break through in his cultivation in the sword Tao, and a myriad of comprehensions surged from his heart. At this moment, he seemed to have completely forgotten that he had a formidable opponent like Ninth Uncle, and he was immersed within the world of his sword Tao, and he ceaselessly deduced and comprehended the various profundities he'd obtained. Sword Emperor, an emperor of the sword that commanded the gods, it was the emperor of sword gods, and it controlled the myriad of sword Taos in the universe. Since the ancient times until now, even if it was amongst existences at the god-rank realm, only a small group of gods were able to attain such a cultivation, and it could be considered to be extremely rare like phoenix feathers and Qilin horns. This obviously showed how difficult it was to attain this cultivation realm in the sword Tao. For example, Xianxia himself had remained at a realm of perfection in the sword god realm for a long time, and he hadn't improved since. If it wasn't for him obtaining the diagram of the bloody damaged sword by chance from the river diagram fragments and obtaining a trace of a critical factor to advance, it would be utterly impossible for him to undergo this transformation at this moment. This was the might of fortune. To existences at the God-rank realm, the amount of time one had cultivated wasn't the standard to judge an expert any longer, and it was that expert's own potential, comprehension ability, physique, and fortune that was of vital importance to that expert's path towards the Tao. Perhaps one could utilize external forces to change one's natural talent, physique, and comprehension ability, yet fortune was a force that could only be chanced upon by luck. Especially to existences at the God-rank realm, sometimes even a tiny piece of fortune would be like a light flap of a butterfly's wings that might cause a gale to sweep through the surroundings. Of course, if one desired to obtain fortune, then one firstly had to encounter it, and secondly, one had to possess the ability to grab a hold of it. Just like this present battle. Xianxia did indeed possess fortune like the diagram of the bloody damaged sword, but if he desired to advance into the Sword Emperor realm, then he similarly had to grab hold of it himself. Thus, Xianxia had done this by utilizing the old man. He'd taken the old man to be a whetstone for his sword, and he intended to utilize the heavy pressure the old man gave him to break through in one go. Rumble. It took a long time to describe, yet only a moment had passed, and Ninth Uncle had shot over explosively once more. The bronze spear in his hand was obviously an extraordinary divine artifact. Even though it wasn't a natural spirit treasure, yet its might was all-powerful and ferocious to the extreme. Moreover, it was even infused with an unyielding and merciless aura, and it was filled with a supreme might that seemed like the might of a primeval fiend god. If it was in the 3 dimensions, then this strike would probably destroy a myriad of cities and cause an irreparable calamity. Xianxia practically instinctively turned his right arm, and then the pitch-black and lusterless talisman armament droned with a clear howl before suddenly sweeping out. Swish! This strand of sword chi seethed through the sky and was extremely blazing. However, right after that, it actually vanished in an instant as if it had been evaporated from the world. Ninth Uncle's pupils constricted abruptly. What's that? At this moment, he was actually unable to capture a trace of that sword chi, and it was even to the extent he wasn't even able to lock onto its aura. It was as if it had really vanished. Could this kid be making an empty show of strength? Hiss! A fine sound that was like the sound emitted from a mosquito resounded. However, when it entered into Ninth Uncle's ears, it was like a thunderclap, and it caused his hair to stand on end while he sensed a strand of an extremely dangerous aura flashing towards him. He practically didn't hesitate to suddenly roar loudly, and Ninth Uncle utilized the heavenly spirit wings to swiftly teleport and flash towards the side at full speed. Bang! Right at the moment he made a move, a strand of sword chi soundlessly appeared behind him, and it grazed past his shoulder, causing a string of blood to spray while the injury was deep to the bone. If he hadn't dodged in time, then this strike would have penetrated his throat. I'm injured? I was actually injured by a little fellow at the world-enlightened true God realm. Ninth Uncle was in disbelief, at the same time that he was furious in his heart. He couldn't help but arouse a strand of indescribable panic. What sort of sword Tao is this? Why is it so mysterious? As a master archer, Ninth Uncle could be said to have attained the perfection in the art of assassination and surprise attacks, yet even he couldn't help but arouse a wisp of terror when facing this sword strike that arrived abruptly out of thin air. This sword strike was completely traceless and soundless, and it was extremely mysterious, because it actually avoided his senses and lock-on, so it wasn't just terrifying. Bang! It was also at this moment that a strand of an extremely terrifying, imposing aura rumbled out from Xianxia, who stood in the distance, and it was like he'd become a completely different person in an instant. Strands of peerlessly blazing sword chi coiled around his body and shot through the world, causing him to seem like an emperor of the sword that intended to command all the sword daos of the world as he roamed it. Such an imposing aura threw the surroundings into disorder. At this moment, it actually caused everything in the world to transform into strands of sword chi that responded to his own vital energy from afar. This was an extremely grand phenomenon. The clouds, mist, rocks, ground, space, And even light in this expanse of the heavens and the earth seemed to carry a wisp of sword insight that was whistling and surging. It was like it had become a world of the sword. Even though they weren't real swords, they were suffused with the insights of the sword. All of this had been created by the vital energy emanated from Xianxia's body. Everything was transformed into a sword, and it acted in cooperation with the entire world and could be commanded with a single thought in the herd. This was the Sword Emperor realm. It was formidable because it was capable of control everything in the world, control the myriad of sword Daos, and it was controlled by one's own Dao heart. This sword strike is mysterious, variable, and moves unexpectedly. Can be considered to be the third sword move after I stepped into the God rank realm, Vorpal Strike. Xianxia muttered in his heart while the blazing glow in his eyes started to return to calm, and his eyes turned deep and vast like the boundless starry sky. At this point in his comprehension, everything had transformed into the sword Dao that he commanded in his heart. At this instant, he'd finally broken through from the Sword God realm and stepped foot into the ranks of the Sword Emperor realm. The Sword Emperor realm? I was actually reduced to a stepping stone for a little bastard to advance. When he witnessed the changes in Xianxia's vital energy, Ninth Elder's extremely ferocious face became extremely unsightly, and it was utterly gloomy. "Little fellow, you must die today." His voice seemed as if it was squeezed out from the cracks between his teeth, and it was filled with boundless rage and hatred. Ninth Uncle held the bronze spear in hand as he strode forward, and he traversed layer upon layer of space to assault Xianxia explosively. If it was said that he took Xianxia to be an ant that he could trample at will earlier, then now, Xianxia who'd transformed and advanced into the Sword Emperor realm was a great calamity in his heart. "Kill!" Ninth Uncle roared furiously as his 27 tall figure that was like a hill smashed through space, and a circle of the glow of divinity actually floated up into appearance from the divine bow tattoo on his face, causing his imposing aura to actually rise explosively in an instant. "Cut the crap, old fellow. You've already lost your chance." Xianxia spoke indifferently while his figure flashed with a swish. He took the initiative to meet the old man in battle, and he casually swung the talisman armament in his hand and utilized the 5-element annihilator to easily destroy the old man's attack. After that, his figure suddenly flashed like an emperor striding through the universe, and a myriad of strands of sword whistled out from his entire body and charged at the old man along with him. Ninth Uncle's expression changed abruptly, and he knew how formidable this strike was. So he executed the heavenly spirit wings to flicker and dodge repeatedly as he didn't dare go head-on against it. However, he noticed to his astonishment that he was like a little boat that had fallen into a world of swords, and he floated indeterminately yet was unable to struggle free from it. It was even to the extent that he might even be obliterated at any moment. How could this be possible? Could it be that this is the might of the Sword Emperor realm? Tempestuous waves arose in Ninth Uncle's heart while the veins on his forehead bulged, and the divine radiance throughout his body rumbled as he swung the bronze spear with the intention of breaking through the restraints upon him and breaking out of this predicament. A young man at the world-enlightened true God realm, a tiny ant that had just stepped foot into the God rank realm had stepped foot into the Sword Emperor realm in battle and executed supreme might that was sufficient to turn the situation of the battle around, and it even oppressed him, a domain-enlightened spirit god, to feel extremely strained. If news of this were to spread, would anyone dare believe it? In the past, even he wouldn't believe this. However, when he truly went against Xianxia, he finally realized how freakish such a young man that couldn't be judged by convention was. Rumble. The battle erupted, and it was intense to the limit. It caused everything within an area of 500,000 kilometers to transform into ruins. As the two of them fought within the heavens and the earth, it caused the sun and moon to dim down while all things trembled, and it truly seemed like doomsday had arrived. Swish! After a short moment, another Vorpal strike appeared abruptly. It seized a momentary gap to instantly injure Ninth Uncle's chest, causing blood to flow while his bones were indistinctly visible. "This is impossible!" Ninth Uncle's roar that shook the heavens and the earth resounded, and it revealed shock, rage, and even a wisp of bewilderment that couldn't be concealed. How could the Sword Emperor realm possibly be so terrifying? He didn't dare believe it. Moreover, he was unable to accept it. All of this had exceeded his past perception. After living for countless years, it was still the first time he'd encountered such a strange and inconceivable situation. Rumble. Before he could recover from his shock, Xianxia's tall figure that was like the figure of an emperor carried vast sword insight as it smashed down. This time, Xianxia intended to capture this old fellow and force the old fellow to tell him everything about the Last Days domain and Ancient God domain for the convenience of his future plans. The Last Days domain, the Ancient God domain. Xianxia was still extremely unfamiliar to both of these places, and he knew nothing about them. The reason was that as soon as he entered the Last Days domain, he didn't even have the time to carefully sense what was different in the Last Days domain before he suffered the attacks of Ninth Uncle and the others. Under such circumstances, Xianxia urgently needed to grasp information related to the Last Days domain and Ancient God domain, otherwise not to mention locating that passageway that led to the Ancient God domain. Even surviving within the Last Days domain would be a problem. On the other hand, Ninth Uncle came from Snow Ink region, and he obviously had a rather good understanding of all this information. Thus, so long as Xianxia captured him, it would be extremely easy for Xianxia to obtain some valuable information. Kill. Xianxia arrived with sword in hand and utilized the calm before the storm that possessed the strongest impacting force. When looked at from afar, it was like a surging ocean of swords, and it was extremely astounding. Bang! An enormous bang resounded. Ninth Uncle seemed as if he'd been struck by lightning, and his 27 tall figure was blasted flying while his countenance turned pale, and he suddenly coughed up a mouthful of blood. Earlier, an injury had been left behind on his chest from Xianxia's vorpal strike, but it was only an injury of the flesh and wasn't serious. Yet now, he was shaken by this sword chi, and it had injured his internal organs instead, causing his combat strength to be affected to a certain extent. This outcome was something Ninth Uncle had never imagined earlier. Wait! At the hands of a young man at the world-enlightened True God realm, it's absolutely impossible for the might of the Sword Emperor realm to be so terrifying. His foundation in the divine Tao, his Tao he utilized to become a god, and even the treasures he possesses are definitely extraordinary. Only in this way would he be able to bring forth such might. At this moment, Ninth Uncle's expression was extremely gloomy. Under the situation of being defeated repeatedly, he'd finally clearly realized that the combat strength she possessed was absolutely not as simple as merely attaining the Sword Emperor realm. This caused him to be shocked, furious, and filled with disbelief in his heart. How could a little bastard that has just stepped into the world-enlightened True God realm possibly possess such a heaven-defying foundation? Swoosh! Before he could recover from his shock, Xianxia's attack had assaulted him once more. Bastard! Do you really think that I can't do anything to a world-enlightened True God like you? Being forced to such a state caused Ninth Uncle to be completely enraged and on the verge of going mad. He utterly stopped holding back, and a buzz resounded as a divine altar floated up into appearance above him. This divine altar was around the size of a palm and 27 tall. It was completely translucent and emanated extremely surging 5-element divinity that was dazzling, resplendent, and caused the heavens and the earth to dim in comparison. In an instant, it was like a divine sun had appeared in the sky, and it illuminated the world. This was a divine altar, and it was also called a divine Tao altar. It was something unique to domain-enlightened spirit gods, and the energy of divine Tao laws, divinity, and a strand of the soul divine flame possessed by a domain-enlightened spirit god was condensed within it. In other words, this divine Tao altar was equivalent to the core of a domain-enlightened spirit god. Yet now, after he was repeatedly oppressed by Xianxia, Ninth Uncle didn't hesitate to utilize his own divine Tao altar and contain all of his might within it. Thus, the might it possessed was simply immeasurable. In merely an instant, Xianxia felt a practically suffocating and terrifying pressure rumble and surge towards him, and it caused his hairs to stand on end while his expression couldn't help but change slightly. Shit! Does this old bastard intend to try bringing me down with him? Xianxia instantly abandoned the thought to capture the old man alive, and he didn't hesitate at all to utilize his full strength and fiercely attack the old man head-on. Under such circumstances, it was already impossible for him to flee or avoid it, and once he revealed even a trace of hesitation, he would be heavily injured by this strike. Rumble. The heavens and the earth shook while an enormous explosion occurred here. All sorts of divine rays of light shot into the sky while numerous huge spatial rifts stretched out, and they were extremely terrifying as they surged towards the distance. Amidst the dust and dirt, Ninth Uncle's ferocious figure trembled violently, and the aura emanated from his entire body suddenly waned while his countenance became ghastly pale and translucent to the extreme. Obviously, after he utilized the Divine Tao altar, it had caused him to suffer extremely serious backlash and be injured. Little bastard. I'll spare you for now, and I'll definitely annihilate you in the future. He glanced resentfully at Xianxia who stood in the distance, and then he utilized the heavenly spirit wings to turn around and flee. He had no choice but to flee because the injuries that covered his entire body had already severely affected his combat strength. So, if he still didn't flee, then he was truly worried that he might perish here. On the other hand, after this collision, Xianxia's countenance had merely become slightly pale, and he seemed as if he hadn't suffered any material injuries. This discovery caused Ninth Uncle to completely abandon the thought of continuing the battle, and he fled. To a domain-enlightened spirit god, being forced to such a state by a world-enlightened true god was truly shameful indeed. Thus, Ninth Uncle spoke those words at the instant before he left. Thump. Unfortunately, Ninth Uncle didn't notice that Xianxia's entire figure shook less than 10 minutes after he left, and it seemed as if Xianxia's body had lost its support, causing him to suddenly fall to the ground and smash open a large crater there. His body twitched without end and had warped slightly as he'd suffered an extremely severe injury. Once a domain-enlightened spirit god fights desperately, it really isn't something I can go against now. Xianxia opened his eyes strenuously while intense pain filled his entire body. Moreover, the divinity within his entire body charged chaotically when he just moved his body slightly, and it was especially because there were many places on his body where broken bones could be seen. His injuries were even more severe than he'd expected. All of this was caused by the old man's Divine Tao altar. It represented the quintessence energies of a domain-enlightened spirit god, and it was extremely terrifying. It was utterly not something a world-enlightened true god like Xianxia could resist completely. This won't do. I can't stay here. The commotion from the battle was too huge, and it might draw the attention of some people. Xianxia gritted his teeth and forcefully circulated his cultivation to repair his injured body. He mended all his broken bones before he stood up with difficulty. That battle from before was truly too dangerous, and it caused him to still have a lingering fear in his heart. Moreover, he didn't dare underestimate any domain-enlightened spirit gods any longer. Because the main reason why he'd suffered a heavy injury earlier was that his understanding of the might possessed by domain-enlightened spirit gods was too shallow. Huff. Xianxia took a deep breath as he silently sensed the situation in the surroundings, and he actually noticed that the aura of divinity in the heavens and the earth was extremely thin and almost non-existent. It was completely without any vitality, and it was utterly unable to give him much help. Could it be that divine energy doesn't exist in the last day's domain? Xianxia frowned. Divine energy was an existence similar to immortal energy. Unfortunately, the last day's domain wasn't the true ancient god domain, so the divine energy possessed within the heavens and the earth was pitiably scarce. Moreover, Xianxia even faintly sensed a type of pressure, and he suffered the pressure from some sort of energy of order. It was the aura of the last day's domain, and it was completely different from the three dimensions and seemed to carry an extremely pressuring effect towards all existences at the god rank realm. Never mind, I'll just leave this place first. Xianxia forcefully endured the injuries and intense pain coming from his entire body, and he distinguished the direction before gritting his teeth and teleporting away in an instant. During this entire process, the injuries on his entire body had split open once more, causing fresh blood to flow. This obviously showed how severe the injuries Xianxia suffered from that collision from before was. It was even to the extent that if Ninth Uncle had turned around and shot another glance at Xianxia, he might have been able to easily annihilate Xianxia. After the time for an incense stick to burn, Xianxia felt the injuries throughout his body become even more severe, and wave after wave of dizziness surged within his mind. He couldn't refrain from stopping any longer, and he didn't dare forcefully teleport any longer as well. This is? Xianxia's gaze swept inadvertently and noticed that he'd arrived within a gorge. All sorts of strange glowing plants grew luxuriantly here. On the other hand, it was numerous pitch-black plants that were like vines that had drawn Xianxia's attention. They creeped throughout the gorge like numerous shackles that covered the ground, and they were pitch-black, thick, large, and suffused with a mysterious glow. After that, Xianxia's expression changed abruptly, because he noticed that the glow emanated by these vines were actually able to corrode his divinity without him realizing it. What a strange plant! Xianxia hurriedly circulated his cultivation and raised his spirits to avoid any mishaps from occurring. His injuries were extremely serious, and he'd been teleporting continuously for the time for an incense stick to burn. At this moment, when he forcefully circulated his cultivation, his entire body instantly trembled and was on the verge of collapse. On the other hand, the glow of the mysterious vines beneath him grew brighter, and then strands of dense grayish-white mist rose up and faintly showed signs of intending to fly up and attack Xianxia. My luck really is terrible. Xianxia cursed in his heart, and he was just about to exert strength in his body to turn around and leave. Goddess! Look, quickly! Divine Vine Kings! Isn't that a type of precious divine treasure you require to refine the Divine Hall treasured spirit pill? Right at this moment, a clear and melodious voice resounded. Someone has actually arrived before us. Unfortunately, we've made a trip in vain again. Huizong, be quiet. That young man is severely injured, and he's being attacked by the Divine Vine Kings right now. Go save him. It can be considered as doing a good deed. After that, a solemn and indifferent voice resounded slowly. It seemed to be ordinary and flat, yet it carried a sense of tranquility that struck directly at the heart, and it seemed as if it was capable of enlightening the benighted, causing others to involuntarily arouse reverence towards the owner of the voice. Xianxia's heart shook when he heard this, and he raised his head with difficulty and intended to look over. He felt something flash before his eyes, and then a green-clothed young woman whose hair was tied up into buns at the top of both sides of her head appeared by his side. The young woman had a pretty appearance and a petite figure. Moreover, he was even carrying a flower basket on her left arm. She seemed like a Tao attendant, and her eyes were pitch black, bright, and extremely lively. You really are injured. The young woman sized Xianxia up from head to toe, and then she chuckled and revealed a mouthful of snow-white teeth. Xianxia was terrified and shocked in his heart. What swift speed! Because he was actually unable to react at all before the young woman actually appeared by his side. Little young master, stay still here and leave the Divine Vine Kings to me. The young woman grinned brightly before she shook the flower basket on her arm. A strange fluctuation arose before the divine glow of wind and lightning actually floated up into appearance and swept out lightly. It directly swept up all the Divine Vine Kings within the gorge, and they were all placed within the flower basket with a swish. This tiny flower basket is actually a natural spirit treasure. Xianxia thought in his heart, and he had a deeper understanding of how extraordinary this young woman was. But right after that, his mind buzzed while a wave of strong dizziness surged throughout his entire body. His injuries had actually started acting up, causing him to almost lose consciousness, and he instantly lost control of his body and fell towards the ground. Oh, goddess! This little young master's injuries seem to be extremely severe. Should we rescue him or not? Never mind. Bring him along with us. Oh! After he heard this conversation, Xianxia put his guard down completely, and his vision turned black as he fell unconscious. While his consciousness was hazy, Xianxia heard a wave of conversation. There's some fate between me and this young man. Don't touch the treasures in his possession after I leave. This voice was solemn and indifferent, and it revealed a force that struck directly at the heart. It was precisely the voice of that goddess. Don't worry, goddess. This voice was deep and low, and it carried a clanging sound like metal rubbing against each other. It was extremely unfamiliar. Huizong, let's go. Oh! Right at this moment, Xianxia somehow summoned the strength to suddenly open his eyes, and he struggled up before he said, "Benefactors, wait a moment. Can you tell me your names? I'll definitely repay you tenfold if I have a chance in the future." As he spoke, a wave of dizziness struck his mind once more, and his vision blurred. He was only able to see two figures yet was unable to see their appearances clearly. This caused a wave of bitterness to arise in his heart. I've only just arrived at the last day's domain, yet I've already been reduced to such a state. I really am misfortunate. Repay us? Hee. There's no need for that, little young master. It's best to take good care of yourself. The pretty young woman in azure clothes that carried a flower basket, Huizong, grinned as she spoke. Let's go. That goddess spoke indifferently and directly disregarded Xianxia's request. Her attitude wasn't haughty, yet it innately carried a bearing of supremacy. It seemed as if she'd only taken Xianxia's words to be a joke. Or perhaps, in her opinion, based on the situation she was currently in, even if his injuries were recovered, it would probably be impossible for him to repay her at all. They actually left just like that. Xianxia was stunned, and he was both dazed and dizzy while he muttered in his heart. Even if you don't mind, but since I owe both of you a favor, then Xianxia, will definitely repay it. Thump! His vision turned black before he fainted once more. When Xianxia woke up again, it was already 2 days later. He noticed that he was actually at a village. The village wasn't large, and over 100 people resided within it, so it was even more similar to an extremely small tribe. An extremely large medicinal field had been established at the front of the village, and all sorts of strange and exotic plants and herbs that emanated a variety of gorgeous multicolored glows were densely planted within it. The 100-plus resides of the village worked within this medicinal field. In other words, they seemed even more like servants that looked after a medicinal field, and all their time, energy, and concentration was utilized on the medicinal field. Is this still the last day's domain? When he found out about all of this, Xianxia was bewildered and extremely puzzled. Moreover, he noticed that every single person within this village wasn't ordinary. Their entire bodies were enveloped by strands of the aura of divinity, yet every single movement they made was no different than the movement of an ordinary commoner, and they didn't know how to utilize various techniques and divine abilities at all. Strange. This entire village is suffused with an aura that's without vitality, and it seems as if it doesn't possess any energy, spirit, or essence. Xianxia was even more bewildered. "You're awake." A hoarse voice that seemed to carry the sound of metal rubbing against each other resounded by Xianxia's ears. Xianxia suddenly raised his head and noticed a middle-aged man pushing the door open and walking in. The middle-aged man wore a bronze ring over his forehead, had a firm expression, and skin that was dark like ironstone. This middle-aged man's aura was ferocious, and he was obviously completely different from the others in the village. He had a resolute and murderous aura while his entire body was coiled by the aura of divinity. He possessed the bearing that only a true expert at the god-rank realm could possess. In Xianxia's opinion, this was the aura of someone that was similar to him. On the other hand, the others in the village were obviously not like true experts at the god-rank realm. Most importantly, as soon as the middle-aged man spoke, Xianxia determined that this was precisely the owner of that voice that spoke with the goddess while he was unconscious. "I'm Tai Kuan, and I'm the Watcher here. I don't care how you suffered those injuries, nor do I care where you're from. Please leave as soon as you've recovered." The middle-aged man who called himself Tai Kuan had a cold and indifferent expression, and he was icy cold and without any emotion. Xianxia was stunned, yet he still nodded and said, "Thank you." Tai Kuan's expression remained indifferent and cold as before while he said, "Can you recover within 7 days of time? It'll probably be sufficient for me to move at that time." Xianxia took a deep breath as he sensed the vital energy within his entire body, and then he spoke slowly. Even though his injuries from before were severe, they hadn't harmed his foundation in the divine Tao. Coupled with his accumulations that were extremely deep, all of his external and internal injuries had already been almost fully healed within these 2 days of time. The only thing he lacked was sufficient divine energy. This was something that couldn't be helped. The dark parasol sapling within his body was only able to emanate immortal energy, and 10 times the immortal energy of the past could merely be converted into a strand of divine energy. According to this speed, he would merely be able to recover around 70% of his cultivation within 7 days of time. On the other hand, the divine energy within this expanse of the heavens and the earth was extremely scarce, and it was utterly insufficient for Xianxia to absorb. Under such circumstances, Xianxia could only place his hopes on the dark parasol sapling to replenish his divine energy. All right, then leave 7 days from now. As soon as he finished speaking, Tai Kuan turned around and walked away. Fellow Taoist, is this still the last day's domain? Xianxia hurriedly asked. Yes. Tai Kuan stopped, and he seemed to be in deep contemplation and was hesitating about something. After a short while, he suddenly raised his hand and tossed over 5 crystals. These are divine crystals. You'll be able to recover slightly more swiftly by utilizing them. Remember, don't allow the others to see these divine crystals. Bang! The door was closed, and only Xianxia remained within the house again. Divine crystals. Xianxia raised his hand and grabbed the 5 crystals over before carefully sizing them up. These crystals were the size of a pinky, completely dazzling and crystalline, and suffused with faint chaotic mist. Besides that, it shockingly contained the purest divine energy within it. This is just like immortal stones and immortal liquid. Obviously, they're required by cultivators to cultivate. Xianxia seemed to be lost in thought. Tai Kung seemed to be very cautious when he produced the divine crystals earlier, and it seemed as if he'd produced some sort of rare and precious treasure. This allowed Xianxia to faintly sense that the value of these divine crystals was definitely extraordinary. Actually, it was extremely obvious. The divine energy within the last day's domain was scarce and practically non-existent. Thus, divine crystals would become even more valuable. But why did he warn me not to allow the others to see the divine crystals? Could it be that he's worried the others would try to seize it from me? Xianxia frowned. Even if he'd already confirmed that he was still within the last day's domain now, he still felt that everything within this village was truly mysterious. Never mind. I'll first rely on these divine crystals to recover my strength. Once I've recovered, I'll leave immediately. Xianxia recalled Tai Kuan's cold and indifferent attitude when dealing with him, and he was very clearly aware that if he didn't leave within 7 days of time, then Tai Kuan would probably be the first to object. When he thought about Tai Kuan, Xianxia couldn't help but recall that goddess and Hui Kong. Where are they from? After that, Xianxia stopped thinking about everything, and he sat cross-legged with a divine crystal in hand and was prepared to start cultivating. Right at this moment, a wave of footsteps resounded from outside his door. Xianxia's brows raised, and he swiftly put those divine crystals away. When he finished doing all of this, a crack resounded as the door was directly opened from the outside. A thin man that was emaciated like a bamboo and had wax-yellow skin walked in. His gaze swept coldly past Xianxia before he said, "Kid, hand over the divine crystals. Otherwise, you'll definitely die today." Xianxia's eyes narrowed, yet his expression remained unchanged as he said, "What divine crystals? Humph, you're even trying to play tricks with me. I saw it clearly earlier, so I'll ask you again. Will you hand it over or not?" The thin man spoke viciously. "Oh." Xianxia seemed to be lost in thought as he said, "If I'm not wrong, Tai Kuan doesn't know that you've come here, right? Little bastard. I asked you to hand the divine crystals over, so hand them over. What's with all the nonsense?" The thin man's expression changed abruptly, as if he was extremely fearful of Tai Kuan. But right after that, a vicious expression flashed on his face before he suddenly charged forward, and then his palm grabbed down towards Xianxia's neck. Swoosh! Swoosh! A strong gale whistled as rumbling resounded from space. However, as far as Xianxia was concerned, such an attack was weak and powerless because it didn't contain any techniques or profundities. This allowed Xianxia to confirm his views from before. Besides Tai Kuan, everyone else within this village wasn't a true existence at the God rank realm. Or perhaps, they possessed the aura of divinity, Yet they'd lost the might possessed by an expert at the god-rank realm. Yet now, even though Xianxia's injuries hadn't healed, he possessed numerous supreme techniques after all. Coupled with his deep foundation in the divine Dane, such an attack was utterly harmless to him. Crack! With a raise of his hand, Xianxia's hand grabbed a hold of the thin man's right arm like a pair of iron pincers. He grabbed onto the thin man's arm to the point cracking sounds resounded, and it was practically on the verge of shattering. Ah! The thin man let out a shrill cry from pain. Shit! Xianxia's heart shook as he stretched out his hand to cover the thin man's mouth, and that shrill cry stopped abruptly. However, all of this was still too late. Even though the thin man's shrill cry only lasted for a short moment, it was extremely ear-piercing, and it spread out of the house and was heard by many others within the village. What's going on? It's Wu Yu's voice. Come. Let's go over together and take a look. In next to no time, clamorous voices mixed with the sounds of various footsteps converged over from afar. Xianxia's face instantly sank when he sensed all of this, and then killing intent surged out from Xianxia's heart. Xianxia truly wished for nothing more than to kill this thin man before him, but he forcefully endured this feeling in the end. But right after that, the clamorous voices that were accompanied by the sound of footsteps had arrived outside his door. Everyone, quickly save me! The thin man suddenly roared loudly with all his might. This caused Xianxia's face to sink once more, and his figure flashed up before he exerted strength with his palm. Bang! The thin man was smashed down to a kneeling position on the ground. Wu Yu? Why would you? Damnable bastard! We were kind enough to rescue you, yet you treat us like this. Kill! Let's attack together and kill this ungrateful bastard. When the others from the village witnessed this scene, they were instantly enraged and directed their anger at Xianxia. They didn't distinguish between right and wrong at all, and all of them charged towards Xianxia who was within the house. Rumble! Before Xianxia could even open his mouth and explain, all of them had already charged over furiously and broke through the house. Space rumbled while the situation fell into chaos. These bastards! Xianxia couldn't help but be slightly infuriated when he saw this, and he suddenly launched a fierce kick at the thin man before his figure flashed and swiftly left this house. Everyone, please allow me to explain. Xianxia intended to provide an explanation. However, to his bitter disappointment, these villagers didn't listen to his explanation at all, and they roared furiously in succession as they charged to attack him. They seemed as if they'd taken him to be their greatest enemy. The situation was utterly chaotic. The battle erupted in an extremely abrupt manner. Never had Xianxia imagined that the situation would actually develop to such a state. It wasn't that he wasn't reasonable, it was these villagers that were extremely unreasonable instead. They seemed to have taken him to be an enemy from the beginning, and the thin man's shrill cry was merely a fuse that became an excuse for them to make a move against Xianxia. Bang! An enormous fist tore through the sky as it smashed space into pieces and descended, and it carried an extremely violent might. However, Xianxia merely raised his palm and blocked this attack, and then that person's figure fell uncontrollably to the ground, causing a thump to resound as a large hole was smashed open. Bastard! How dare you continue to act violently? Attack him together! The other villagers roared loudly with fury when they saw this, and they swarmed towards Xianxia like tidewater. Xianxia swept them with his gaze, and he instantly felt reassured in his heart. His figure flickered repeatedly, and every single time it flickered, a villager would be easily suppressed to the ground without fail. In merely a short moment, numerous figures were already lying all over the ground, and they were letting out endless shrill cries. It really is as I expected. Even though these fellows possess the bodies of gods, their attacks don't carry any divine das, and it seems as if they don't know how to utilize any divine Dao techniques at all. Xianxia's figure suddenly stopped moving, and he seemed to be lost in thought as he looked at all the villagers that lay on the ground. In this conflict that had erupted abruptly, he'd practically not utilized any formidable techniques at all before striking all of them down. Not a single one of them was able to go against him, and the reason was that these villagers were too weak. They were like children that held sharp blades. Even though the blade was terrifying, they didn't know how to utilize the blade. Strange, they clearly already possess the body of gods. Yet they don't possess the energy of divine Tao laws or combat techniques. How could there be such a strange thing in the world? She frowned and was rather bewildered. Everyone. This fellow possesses divine crystals. The thin man that was captured by she earlier was lying on the ground at this moment. But he seemed to be extremely unwilling to watch she win the battle, so he immediately shouted loudly in a grim voice. These words seemed to be extremely sudden and baseless. However, the words divine crystals amidst what he said caused the eyes of those villagers she had defeated to instantly turn red. Besides hatred, their gazes towards she carried a strand of the glow of extremely burning greed. Kill! Kill him! Divine crystals! If I possess divine crystals, then I'll absolutely be able to leave this damnable last day's domain. The defeated villagers on the ground seemed to have been given an extremely strong stimulant, and they suddenly struggled to get up. Moreover, they charged once more towards she amidst a wave of clamorous roars. They seemed as if they truly wished for nothing more than to tear she into pieces. Why are these bastards so irrationally covetous of divine crystals? She's eyes narrowed while killing intent surged into appearance because a trace of rage couldn't help but arise in his heart from being taken to be prey by others. Stop! Suddenly, a clanging voice that sounded like metal rubbing together against each other resounded through the heavens and the earth. After that, rumbling resounded as a strand of terrifying divine might crushed down, and it instantly suppressed all the villagers to the ground, causing them to be unable to get up again. After that, she saw Tai Kuan tear space apart and arrive here with a gloomy expression. What's going on? Tai Kuan didn't even spare a glance at Shi, and he swept his gaze towards those villagers instead. I just left for a moment, yet such chaos has occurred. Could it be that all of you intend to be sent to death at the hunting area? All of them were silent like cicadas in the winter, and they simultaneously started shivering without end. There was no hatred, resentment, or greed in their expressions any longer, and it was replaced by reverence. Moreover, the gazes they shot at Tai Kuan seemed as if they were looking at the respected arrival of an overlord. Humph! Tai Kuan grunted coldly. In the end, he waved his hand and said, Disperse! All of them seemed as if they'd been exonerated, and they left dejectedly. She couldn't help but ask when he saw this. Fellow Taoist Tai Kuan, what exactly is going on? Tai Kuan glanced coldly at Shi, and he went silent for a short moment before he said, Come with me. As he spoke, he placed his hands behind his back and walked directly towards the front of the village. Shi followed closely behind him. In next to no time, they arrived at the front of the village. An extremely large medicinal field covered this area, and all sorts of strange plants and herbs were planted in it. All of them were plants and herbs that she had never seen in the 3 dimensions. She noticed that the aura contained within those plants and herbs wasn't divine energy, and they were completely different from the immortal herbs he'd seen in the past. They were filled with a strand of indescribable and obscure aura, and they were extremely strange. At this moment, many villagers were working in the field with care and concentration, and they seemed to be deeply afraid of damaging these plants and herbs. On the other hand, she was shocked because those plants and herbs seemed as if they were alive. Their branches and leaves emanated strands of dazzling light that moved like tentacles and pierced into the bodies of those villagers. Yet those villagers seemed as if they didn't notice it at all, and from the beginning until the end, they had numb expressions and didn't avoid it at all. Could it be that those plants and herbs are absorbing the energy within the bodies of those villagers as nourishment? Shi frowned. He felt that this scene was extremely mysterious, and it caused him to feel rather uncomfortable. They were originally experts at the God-rank realm from the various worlds. Before they arrived at the last day's domain, all of them were great figures that commanded monstrous authority in their respective worlds, and they received the respect and admiration of all living beings. Tai Kuan spoke indifferent. But once they arrived here, they're only a group of pitiable people. If they don't want to die, then they can only be reduced to herb slaves with lowly statuses, and they're no different than ants. Why is it like this? Xianxia frowned while a trace of coldness surged out from his heart. Because by relying on their own ability, it's utterly impossible for them to arrive at the ancient god domain, whereas there are only two methods if one desires to survive in the last days domain. Tai Kuan said, the first is to be a herb slave in the medicinal field area. This is the safest method. Even though one would lose the divine Tao laws and techniques one possessed, so long as one worked obediently, then one wouldn't have to worry about encountering any danger. With their foundations at the god rank realm, it would be sufficient for them to survive for eternity. Tai Kuan paused for a moment and continued. The second method is to be sent to the hunting area as prey. However, this is extremely dangerous, and there's only a slim chance of survival. Only a few lucky fellows are able to survive in that place. However, one can't say for sure if they'll be hunted and killed one day. So unless they had no other choice, no one would be willing to be sent to the hunting area and be reduced to prey that's at the mercy of others. So in this way, the last days domain is roughly divided into two areas. The first is the medicinal field area, and the second is the hunting area. Xianxia's brows raised as he spoke. Tai Kuan said, yes. Xianxia's expression became grim as well, and he said, then who's the owner of the medicinal field area and hunting area? Tai Kuan turned around to glance indifferently at Xianxia, and then he said, have you still not guessed the answer now? It's naturally the various great powers in the ancient god domain. Xianxia was extremely shocked in his heart while a cold glow shot out from his eyes, and he seemed to have roughly understood something. The last days domain had been completely taken control of by the great figures of the ancient god domain, and they divided it into the medicinal field area and hunting area. Under the precondition of being unable to enter the ancient god domain, all those experts at the god rank realm who were restrained and dragged into the last days domain could only choose from these two methods to survive. The first was to be an herb slave and grow plants and herbs for the great figures of the ancient god domain. Doing this was the safest, yet one would lose the divine Tao laws and various techniques that one possessed. The second was to be reduced to becoming prey that was sent to the hunting area, and one would become the prey that those great figures of the ancient god domain hunted. It was extremely dangerous, and it could be said that there was only a slim chance of surviving there. As for the existence of the hunting area, it was extremely easy to understand. The influential figures in the mortal world would establish some hunting forests for themselves to hunt, and they took hunting to be a pleasure that relieved their boredom. Obviously, the hunting area in the last days domain was a roughly similar existence. However, the prey had become those experts at the god rank realm who'd been restrained and dragged into the last days domain, whereas the hunters had become the great figures from the ancient god domain instead. This caused Xianxia to suddenly recall the moment he'd just stepped into the last days domain and the surprise attack he'd suffered. In the conversation between the white-robed young man, ninth uncle, and the others, they seemed to have taken him to be prey, and they'd utterly not taken him to be a true god. Obviously, the white-robed young man's group had definitely come from the ancient god domain. Why do I feel that the last days domain is like a place for leisure and recreation created by those great figures of the ancient god domain? Xianxia's expression was slightly gloomy. There was nothing wrong with recreation and leisure, but if the targets of recreation and leisure were experts at the god rank realm, and if they were taken as prey and herb slaves that could be oppressed at will, then this was something that Xianxia was slightly unable to accept. It isn't just the last days domain, even the worlds outside the ancient god domain are only resources in the control of those great figures. Tai Kuan said indifferently. If it was said that the heaven Tao all of you comprehended before becoming gods was an expanse of fertile farmland, then all of you cultivators throughout the various words are the crops within the farmland. Your cultivation is the process of growing of crops, and when ripe crops appear in these farmlands, they'll be reaped so as to avoid them affecting the growth of other crops. The heaven Tao was compared to a farmland, cultivators were compared to crops that grew on the farmland. Moreover, when the crops were ripe, it would be time to reap the harvest. If he heard this analogy in the past, Xianxia would definitely be disdainful towards it. Yet now, after he experienced everything within the last days domain, he suddenly understood how suitable this analogy was. It was even to the extent it caused bone-piercing coldness to arise in his heart. Moreover, there was even a type of indescribable rage within him. He was completely stunned on the spot while his hands were unconsciously clenched together tightly, and even the veins on the surface of his hands bulged. The so-called ripe crops are cultivators that advance to the God-rank realm, right? Xianxia spoke in a low voice. Yes. Taikuan nodded. Xianxia suddenly recalled everything he saw in the three dimensions. At that time, the calamity descended and swept through the three dimensions, and then the divine chains of order enveloped down and forcefully restrained and dragged away numerous existences at the God-rank realm. When he thought about it now, were the divine chains of order that descended from the calamity any different than sickles that reaped the ripe crops? Moreover, this sickle was naturally controlled by the great figures of the ancient god domain. Why did they reap the crops? It was naturally for the sake of providing food for those great figures of the ancient god domain to enjoy, and wealth that they could enjoy themselves with. After he understood all of this, Xianxia's entire body felt icy cold from head to toe, and his expression was completely livid and gloomy. The heaven Dao was like a cage, a coop, a farmland. All the living beings in the various worlds had instead become the caged birds, the beasts in a coop, and the crops in farmland within the eyes of the great figures of the ancient god domain, and they were played with, killed, and reaped. If all of this was the truth, then it was too cruel. This was the reason Xianxia was completely enraged, because he was one of them as well. If he didn't know all of this, then perhaps he would have never thought about all of this. Yet now he knew, and he'd understood the truth, so how could he restrain the rage in his heart? Why did you tell me all of this? Xianxia spoke in a low voice. Because you were brought here by the goddess. Taikuan's answer was extremely simple. Suddenly, Xianxia came to realization, and he understood that it made no difference no matter how enraged he was, and he was unable to change the situation in reality. It was even to the extent that he was clearly aware that if it wasn't because of that mysterious goddess, then Taikuan wouldn't tell him all of this at all. It was even to the extent that it was extremely likely that he would have been captured when he was heavily injured, and he would have either become an herb slave, became prey, or been killed. This was reality. There was also the true face of the last days domain. It was dangerous, cruel, and filled with killing intent. The slightest carelessness might cause one to be fated to perish here, and even gods were unable to survive. May I ask exactly what sort identity that goddess possesses? Xianxia took a deep breath and had calmed down completely. All through his path of cultivation until now, he'd experienced the baptism of countless battles and blood, and he'd long since tempered a Tao heart that was resolute, tenacious, and peerless. Since goddess was unwilling to tell you, then as someone with a low status, I naturally don't dare to expose the answer to you. Taikuan said indifferently. Perhaps if you have the chance to enter the ancient god domain, then you'll find out about goddess identity. If you're unable to accomplish that, then it's useless to know so much. As he spoke, he pointed towards the medicinal field in the distance and said, Look at those herb slaves. All those years ago when they entered the last days domain, every single one of them were willing to fight to the death in order to enter the last days domain. But in the end, they could only accept this fate of being a slave. You're definitely unwilling to become one of them. So make the best use of your time to recover your cultivation and leave as soon as possible. Xianxia puckered his lips, yet he suddenly asked a different question, and he said, The divine Tao laws and techniques they possess were seized by the herbs within that medicinal field? Yes. Taikuan nodded, and he spoke of the reason behind it. It turned out that the last days domain was practically boundlessly vast, and it was covered with all sorts of medicinal fields. All of the medicinal fields were established by the great figures of the ancient god domain, and they belonged to various different powers. Unlike the medicinal fields at other places, the medicinal fields in the last days domain only had a single type of herb planted in them, divine Daofuse herbs. This divine herb was extremely unique and extraordinarily overpowering. It utilized the divine Tao laws and techniques grasped by experts at the God-rank realm as nourishment, and it was only able to survive in this way. This was no different than a technique to take possession of the body of another, and the only difference was that the divine Dao-fused herbs didn't take possession of the body and took possession of the divine Dao laws and techniques grasped by existences at the God-rank realm instead. The reason that the combat strengths of those herb slaves was extremely weak was because the divine Dao laws and techniques within them had been absorbed by the divine Dao-fused herbs. After he found out about all of this, Xianxia's heart went cold once more. Because the existence of the divine Dao-fused herbs was simply cruel to the extreme, and it was no different than the acts of those from evil sects. They'll be reaped after they ripen, and then they'll be sent to the ancient god domain for the alchemists of those great powers to refine into divine pills. After that, they'll be provided to the disciples of those sects to consume, allowing them to obtain the divine Dao laws and techniques contained within them. Tai Kuan continued. In other words, you can take these divine Dao-fused herbs to be numerous divine Dao laws and various different books on techniques. So long as they're consumed, they'll be able to allow a disciple that possesses a foundation in the divine Dao to grasp various divine Dao laws and techniques overnight. Xianxia's pupils constricted when he heard this, and he was extremely shocked in his heart. He finally understood everything. Those great figures of the ancient god domain had established these medicinal fields and planted divine Dao-fused herbs in them before utilizing those captured experts at the god-rank realm as nourishment, and the divine Dao laws and techniques they possessed were absorbed. When these divine Dao-fused herbs ripened, they would be sent to the ancient god domain, refined into divine pills, and provided to disciples to be consumed. On the other hand, when these disciples consumed these divine pills, they would be able to obtain divine Dao laws and various techniques in a short period of time. If the various segments of this entire process was disregarded, it was equivalent to the disciples of those great powers in the ancient god domain relying on the divine Dao-fused herbs as a medium to seize the divine Dao laws and techniques possessed within these experts at the god-rank realm, whom had been captured into the last days domain. How cruel was this? We're meat on someone else's chopping block. Xianxia muttered while he was infuriated to the limit in his heart, and it was even to the extent that he was ridiculously furious. He originally thought that the ancient god domain was an eternal kingdom, a paradise where the gods resided and wandered about freely, and even if there were battles and disputes, it was still something to yearn for. But who would have expected that the truth was actually like this? Actually, even if these medicinal fields didn't exist, the gods that arrive at the last days domain will be suppressed by the energy of the heaven Dao within this expanse of the heavens and the earth. Tai Kuan glanced at Xianxia, and he seemed to be surprised by Xianxia's composure. But in next to no time, he recovered his calm and said flatly, "Under this suppression, the strength possessed by all experts at the god-rank realm will be washed away without one noticing. No matter how formidable your cultivation is, the divine Dao laws and techniques you possess will be lost within 10 years at most." He paused for a moment and continued, "This is the most dangerous aspect of the last days domain. Last days. Last days. It silently strips you of everything you possess. So that's where this name came from," Xianxia muttered, and then he suddenly realized something instead and gazed at Tai Kuan. "Why did you—" Before he could finish speaking, Tai Kuan said, "Because I'm from the ancient god domain, and I possess the energy of divine Dao laws from the god domain. I'm not afraid of the suppression of the energy of the heaven Dao in the last days domain." Xianxia nodded, and he was finally enlightened. Even the energy of the heaven Dao had its differences. For example, the heaven Dao in the Darchu dynasty was unable to compare with the heaven Dao of the Dark Reverie, whereas the heaven Dao in the Dark Reverie was similarly unable to be compared to the heaven Dao in the Immortal dimension. Based on this, the heaven Dao in the three dimensions was similarly unable to compare with the heaven Dao in the last days domain, and obviously the heaven Dao of the ancient god domain was clearly superior to the last days domain. It allowed Tai Kuan to be unafraid of all of this. Quickly cultivate. Every day longer you stay in the last days domain, you'll lose some divine Dao laws and techniques. If you intend to enter the ancient god domain, then time is the key. Tai Kuan turned around and left. Xianxia caught up to him and said, "Fellow Taoist, wait a moment. I still have a question in my heart." "Speak. Why do I have to leave within 7 days of time?" "Because you were injured, and you've obviously been targeted by some people upon entering the last days domain. Even though you were lucky enough to escape with your life and be rescued by the goddess, but I don't want to offend those people because I took you in. Tai Kuan's answer was extremely cold, indifferent, and direct. Not to mention I'm only of lowly status, and I can't afford to offend those figures from the ancient god domain. Xianxia frowned. But in the end, he took a deep breath and cupped his fists before he said, "No matter what, I still have to thank you for your guidance." His tone was serious and sincere. Xianxia really didn't hate Tai Kuan for mercilessly refusing him because he never had a relationship with Tai Kuan at all. So why should Tai Kuan protect him? Of course, Xianxia didn't intend to seek Tai Kuan's protection either. Tai Kuan was stunned. He seemed to have never expected that Xianxia's attitude towards him would be like this, and his expression eased up slightly while he said, "You don't have to thank me. All of this was instructed by the goddess." Xianxia said, "I'll naturally repay the goddess in the future." Tai Kuan nodded, and then he suddenly asked, "Who exactly did you offend when you entered the last day's domain?" "I didn't offend anyone at all." Xianxia laughed bitterly and shrugged before he described the sequence of events to Tai Kuan. "That ninth uncle you spoke of had the pattern of a divine bow tattooed on his face?" Tai Kuan's brows raised, and he revealed a rare expression of being slightly moved before he said with a solemn voice, "If I'm not wrong, then that white-robed young man is probably from the Dai clan within Snow Ink region. That's one of the top divine clans in Snow Ink region, and it controls numerous universes." The Dai clan? Xianxia's eyes narrowed as he faintly recalled a legend in the three dimensions. During the primeval times, there was a natural fiend god born from within the chaos, and he was called Dai. He possessed peerless attainments in the Tao of archery, and he'd once successively shot and killed 9 sun crows in sky out of rage. He possessed monstrous divine might, and this deed shocked the universe. However, a long time ago when the three dimensions was established, this natural fiend god, Dai, had vanished, and he became a legend that the future generations could only take delight in talking about. Wait, you said you actually escaped from a domain enlightened spirit god. Suddenly, Tai Kuan recalled something, and his eyes suddenly erupted with a strand of divine light. It locked firmly onto Xianxia, and he seemed as if he intended to distinguish something. Xianxia said ambiguously, "I was just lucky. If the goddess didn't rescue me in time, then the consequences would be unimaginable." Xianxia didn't tell Tai Kuan that if it wasn't for that ninth uncle utilizing the divine Tao altar with the intention of taking Xianxia down with him, then it would be utterly impossible for Xianxia to have been injured and fled. Most importantly, he'd fled first before he encountered that goddess and the young woman Huizong by chance. As for being rescued by them in the end, it could be said as an action that was done casually. "Oh!" Tai Kuan glanced at Xianxia while seeming to be lost in thought, and he said with deep meaning, "According to my knowledge, not just any world-enlightened true god can fight a domain-enlightened spirit god, and not just anyone can obtain the help of the goddess." Xianxia smiled and didn't provide any explanation, and he seemed to be slightly mysterious. "You're very unusual." Tai Kuan didn't persist on this question, and he glanced deeply at Xianxia once more before he said, "Even though I'm unable to help you, if you have any questions, then feel free to come look for me. The precondition is that you must leave within 7 days of time." As soon as he finished speaking, he'd already placed his hands behind his back and left swiftly. Tai Kuan really is an odd fellow. Perhaps I'll be able to obtain even more valuable information from him. Xianxia stared at Tai Kuan as he left, and then pondered deeply for a moment. After that, Xianxia shook his head before turning around and returning to his own house. Within the house in the village, Xianxia sat cross-legged while mist and clouds coiled around him, and he was suffused with divine radiance while emanating strands of auspicious light. 2 divine crystals that were emanated thick and gurgling pure divine energy lay in his hand, and they entered into the universe within Xianxia's body through a full circulation in his body, and they ceaselessly replenished his divine energy. The divine crystals were indeed unbelievable. They were completely different from ordinary immortal stones, and they didn't just contain extremely shocking and pure divine energy. They even contained strands of faint energy of order that was greatly beneficial to the tempering of one's foundation in the divine Tao. Swish! Under the assistance of the divine crystals, Powerful divine energy flowed into Xianxia's body like tidewater, and his severely exhausted cultivation was recovering at a shocking speed. 2 days later, two bangs resounded as the two divine crystals in Xianxia's palm had exploded into pieces, and then they transformed into powder that dispersed into the surroundings. 2 divine crystals are comparable to the fruits of cultivating for an entire month by relying on the dark parasol sapling. However, this is far from sufficient. If I want to recover my entire strength, then I would at least require over 10 divine crystals. Xianxia cultivated while he observed the state of his body. Tai Kuan had only given him 5 divine crystals this time, and it was far from being sufficient to allow him to recover his cultivation to its peak state in a short period of time. However, Xianxia was already extremely satisfied. According to his deduction, when he left this village 5 days from now, he would have almost recovered around 70% of his cultivation, and this strength would be more than enough to deal with an ordinary world enlightened true God. Of course, if he encountered that 9th uncle from the Date clan, then Xianxia could only choose to flee. He might be able to rely on some secret techniques to annihilate 9th uncle if he recovered to his peak state. However, unless he had no other choice, Xianxia wouldn't do this either. These so-called secret techniques were extremely harmful to him as well. For example, if he utilized the Godslaughter burst, then he would be utterly unable to battle for at least 3 months of time. Presently, I've just advanced into the world-enlightened true God realm, and it's utterly impossible for my cultivation to improve once more in a short period of time. So if I want to improve my combat strength, I can only choose to temper my divine Tao laws. As he contemplated this, Xianxia withdrew 2 more divine crystals and cultivated silently. The battle with 9th uncle allowed him to break through into the Sword Emperor realm in one go, and he possessed the supreme might to command all swords. He was like an emperor amongst sword gods, and it was sufficient to make all the gods of the sword bow before him. Even though the divine Tao Xianxia possessed could only be considered to have been attained to the basic stage, his breakthrough in his cultivation in the Sword Tao had greatly made up for this weakness. Overall, it was already impossible for his current cultivation realm and cultivation in the Sword Tao to undergo a breakthrough in a short period of time, so the only thing that could improve his combat strength was the divine Tao laws. Divine Tao laws were divided into the basic stage, initial stage, advanced stage, peak stage, and perfection stage. Every single stage was a type of completely different transformation, and it was like the difference between the heavens and the earth, because this was the Tao of gods, and it was the supreme path towards the Tao that gods sought. Every single step ahead was extremely difficult, and even if they exhausted an extremely long period of time on it, it was utterly impossible to take that stride without possessing the required natural talent and comprehension ability. Generally speaking, it was already considered a shocking accomplishment if one was able to attain the initial stage in one's divine Tao laws while at the domain enlightened spirit god realm. For example, that 9th uncle was just like that. He was one of the few top-rate experts in the domain enlightened spirit god realm, and the reason was that he'd attained the initial stage in the 5-element divine Tao. Other ordinary domain enlightened spirit gods were mostly still stuck at the basic stage. On the other hand, Xianxia was able to fight 9th uncle and remain undefeated while surmounting a realm to do battle, and it was even to the extent that he forced 9th uncle to utilize his divine Tao altar with the intention of bringing Xianxia down with him. This obviously showed how abnormal the combat strength that Xianxia, who just stepped foot into the god rank realm, possessed was. If news of this battle were to spread, then there would probably be no one that would believe it. Presently, Xianxia had turned his attention towards tempering the divine Tao laws. He had a feeling that if he was able to grasp the talisman divine Tao to the initial stage, then if he encountered that 9th uncle once more, it would be useless even if 9th uncle fought him desperately. 3 days later, the remaining divine crystals were completely refined and absorbed by Xianxia, and at this moment, his cultivation had already recovered by around 70%. According to our agreement, I have to leave this village in another 2 days of time. I'll seize this opportunity to go look for Tai Kuan and obtain a slightly more detailed understanding of the last day's domain and ancient god domain. Xianxia suddenly opened his eyes and awoke from his cultivation. Presently, he merely knew that the last day's domain possessed boundless territories, and the energy of heaven Tao within it was extremely unique. It was capable of soundlessly exhausting the divine Tao laws and various techniques possessed by an expert at the God-rank realm. At the same time, this expanse of territories was roughly divided into the medicinal field area and hunting area. However, he was still utterly unaware of exactly how these two territories were divided and distinguished. Most importantly, he urgently needed to know exactly where that passageway that led to the ancient god domain was. When he thought up to here, he stopped hesitating any longer, and he stood up before pushing open the door and walking out. Rumble. Right at the instant Xianxia walked out of the house, a wave of violent rumbling resounded, and it was extremely intense. It surged like thunderclaps as it swept through the heavens and the earth, and the entire village was alarmed by it. Moreover, there was a group of villagers extremely far away that held weapons as they charged out and rushed towards the distance. Damn it! It's definitely those bastards from Azure Lotus Divine sect that have come to invade us again. Humph! They've been coveting our medicinal field for a very long time now. If it wasn't for Lord Tai Kuan's protection, they would have succeeded a long time ago. Let's go over quickly. Xianxia caught up to one of the villagers and asked, "What's going on?" That village said furiously, "Lord Tai Kuan is in battle. We're going to assist him." Assist? Xianxia swept all of them with his gaze, and he muttered in his heart, "With all of your ability, you don't even have any combat strength at all, so would going there be any different than giving your lives away? Little bastard, are you looking down on us? All those years ago before we came to the last day's domain, was any one of us not an existence that roamed freely through the world?" That villager seemed to have seen through Xianxia's thoughts, and he spoke with a gloomy expression. Xianxia smiled and neither admitted nor denied it. He was naturally clearly aware that if these villagers were in the outside world, then all of them would be world-shocking supreme existences. Yet now, they'd already lost their divine Tao laws and combat techniques, so they were like tigers that had their teeth pulled out and they weren't terrifying at all. However, Xianxia really admired them in his heart, because they were clearly aware that heading over there would be no different than giving their lives away, yet they still disregarded their safety and intended to head over to assist Tai Kuan. This sort of disposition was extremely difficult to come by. This obviously showed how high Tai Kuan's status was in the hearts of these villagers. In next to no time, Xianxia arrived at an expanse of extremely spacious and desolate plains that was extremely far away from the village. At this moment, Xianxia finally saw clearly that Tai Kuan was being jointly attacked at this moment, and he was going against 3 opponents by himself. He was suppressed to the point he was practically on the verge of being defeated, and his entire body was covered in injuries, causing blood to dye his clothes red. He was in an extremely dangerous situation. It wasn't just that, there was a group of figures standing far away from the battlefield, and they numbered around 8 in total. All of them stood proudly in space while they pointed fingers at Tai Kuan and discussed with relaxed expressions, and they seemed to be extremely arrogant and domineering. In merely an instant, Xianxia determined that all of these unfamiliar faces that appeared here were at the world-enlightened true God realm. Moreover, they were completely different from those herb slaves because they hadn't lost their divine Tao laws and techniques. This meant that these people had definitely come from the ancient God domain as well. Only the experts of the ancient God domain weren't afraid of the suppression from the energy of the heaven Tao within the last day's domain. A total of 10 people, and every single one of them are world-enlightened true gods. The strongest amongst them is that yellow-clothed woman at the center because her imposing aura is clearly more formidable than the others. She's probably already stepped foot into the domain-enlightened spirit god realm. Xianxia swiftly deduced in his heart. In an instant, the strengths every single one of them possessed was reflected in his heart. However, they seem to not be from a single group, and there's an obvious gap in the relationship between them. They're probably a group that joined forces temporarily. Strange, why would Tai Kuan have offended them? After that, Xianxia's pupils constricted. He noticed to his shock that there was a scroll in the yellow-clothed woman's hand, and the portrait of a young man was drawn on it. Shockingly, that was a portrait of him. Could it be that these fellows came to search for and capture me? Xianxia's face sank. He roughly understood that Tai Kuan was being jointly attacked because of trying to protect him. "Haha! A group of herb slaves dared to come to the rescue? All of you stay obediently on the spot. Otherwise you'll be killed without mercy. At this moment, the group of people outside the battlefield noticed the villagers that had come to help, and a gold-robed man that had white hair and a handsome appearance like that of a young man suddenly sneered as he spoke with a ghastly voice. Along with this voice, a strand of terrifying divine might swept out from him like tidewater, and it smashed down fiercely towards the villagers, causing even space to be struck to the point of wailing without end. A wave of shrill cries of pain resounded. Those villagers were merely herb slaves that didn't possess any combat strength at all. So how could they endure such a powerful aura? They were deterred by that strand of divine might before they could even approach the battlefield, and their minds and hearts suffered heavy injuries to the point they almost fell to their knees. Humph! Right at this moment, Xianxia suddenly took a step forward, and as his eyes opened, strands of shocking divine radiance surged out explosively. Bang! Merely a single step was like a heavenly god striking a drum, and it rumbled through the heavens and the earth. At practically the exact same moment, a strand of terrifying and icy cold killing intent swept out like a raging ocean of swords. Bang! 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 Under the might of Xianxia's terrifying imposing aura, the aura emanated by that gold-robed man was easily shattered like a bubble. It vanished completely and wasn't able to resist Xianxia's aura at all. Moreover, this strand of Xianxia's divine might didn't lose momentum and swept through the surroundings. It caused the heavens and the earth to dim down, and it shocked everyone in the distance to the point their hearts trembled while their gazes shot over in succession. Eh? That kid doesn't seem to be a herb slave? Wait, isn't he that kid we're looking for? Ha ha ha. He really was hiding here. This damnable tycoon actually dared to conceal this. He simply deserves death. If that third young master of the Dai clan finds out, then he'll definitely annihilate 9 generations of tycoon's family. When they saw Xianxia's appearance clearly, all of them, including the yellow-clothed woman, were surprised, and a wisp of happiness floated up onto their faces, as if they'd noticed the prey that they were searching for since a long time ago. On the other hand, at this moment, Xianxia finally determined that they'd really come for him. Moreover, it was shockingly the white-robed young man's group from the Dai clan that put them up to this.